Jon Snow had grown accustomed to Winterfell's silences. Even on the busiest days, with ravens flapping in the rookery and the clang of hammers in the forges, he would find pockets of quiet that settled across the old stone halls. Ever since the end of the war and the long, dark nights that consumed them while death walked the world, Winterfell had changed. Perhaps everyone had changed with it. Yet for Jon, the silence had become a solace. It let him think, reflect on his place in the North, and weigh the burdens left to him by those who had molded his life. He never forgot that, for most of his life, he had believed himself simply Ned Stark's bastard, a boy of no great name, always on the margins. Then, at the edges of chaos, he discovered he was something else entirely. His father's blood still ran in his veins, or so he believed of Eddard Stark, but there was also a fire in his heritage he still barely comprehended. The wind whistled across the courtyard as Jon trudged across the snow-dusted cobblestones, gloves pressed hard around the pommel of the sword at his hip. Ghost, his ever-present dire wolf, followed at his side, silent as a shadow with fur white as the drifts piling against the walls. The noon sun hung low, gray clouds drifting across the pale sky. Daylight was thin in the north. Winter lingered, as was its nature, though the worst of the brutal storms had passed. The Great War was over, or so they prayed. He could not help but glance at the battered towers and partially reconstructed gates, remembering what horrors had assailed them. And he remembered the cost. His breath plumed white in front of his face. He heard a faint ring of steel from across the yard, where a stable boy and a newly anointed guardsman tested each other with practice swords. The clang carried on the thin air, echoing over old stone. Jon found his thoughts drifting deeper to the crypts below the castle. He had been there many times, but something had begun to tug at him in his sleep, a presence, a whisper of winter whined through hidden tunnels. He had woken in the night, cold sweat soaking his nightclothes, the echo of a roar in his ears. In those dreams, he would see a silhouette of a beast in the darkness, coiled and bound, thrashing against ancient restraints. The crypts had always felt haunted. But this was different, a heartbeat throbbing beneath the ground, as if the earth itself labored to contain a terrible power. Jon told no one of these dreams. Not Sansa, who oversaw Winterfell with a meticulous eye for every detail. Not Arya, who came and went with ghostly stealth, more wolf than lady. Not Bran, who drifted through life now with that eerily detached expression, as if peering across time instead of occupying the present. Each of them carried their own burdens. If something lurked in the crypts, he would face it first alone. That night, when all had quieted and the wind was but a faint hiss along Winterfell's battlements, Jon descended into the crypts. He carried a torch, the flames flickering orange and red against dark stone. Ghost padded at his side, ears perked, tail low. The corridor stretched before them, lined with statues of long-dead Stark kings and lords. Their features were worn by time, although the likenesses tried to capture the solemn, grave manner for which the family was known. Ned Stark's statue stood among them, near the newer section, a testament to the man who had raised Jon under a quiet sense of honor. Jon bowed his head as he passed, his heart clenching in memory. He had no map for the crypt's deeper recesses, only half-remembered tales. There were stories about hidden vaults and secret passages, about entire sections that had been bricked off or left undiscovered. Tales whispered of vaults older than the Starks themselves, sealed by the first men or even older peoples. Jon could not explain why these stories kept surfacing in his mind, only that the dreams compelled him forward. The cold grew sharper the farther in he went. His torch sputtered as if the very air rebelled against the flame. The crypt passage ended at a broad wall of carved stone, flanked by two ancient wolf heads. The design was faint from centuries of erosion, but Jon felt a chill deeper than any winter's air. Ghost's hackles rose and the dire wolf let out a soft whine, like a warning. Jon pressed his free hand against the carved wolf on the left. To his surprise, the stone shifted, revealing a narrow gap. Air whooshed out of that gap, stale and frigid, laced with an odor he could not name. It was neither purely must nor rot, but more primal, a reek of scaled skin and old smoke. He had never smelled anything like it in the north. His heart pounded. He squeezed through the gap, holding his torch aloft, Ghost inching through after him. The hidden passage sloped downward, steps worn smooth by centuries of neglect. The very walls seemed to sweat with cold condensation, droplets glimmering under the torch's uncertain light. He could feel each heartbeat echo in his ears. Something lay down here, silent and forgotten, and he sensed its presence like a faint tremor in the air. He descended until he came to an archway sealed by iron bars gone rust-red with time. A swirl of dust brushed his cheeks. The bars were thick but corroded, and when he pressed against them, he found them locked by a formidable iron chain. Something pressed at the edges of his mind, urging him on. Carefully he reached for Longclaw, bracing the torch against the wall. The sword's Valyrian steel glimmered faintly in the torchlight. With a single mighty swing, he brought the blade down on the chain. Sparks flew, and with a second strike, the chain split, links clattering to the ground with a racket that rang in the enclosed space. The bars groaned as he forced them open, each hinge screaming protest at being disturbed. He stepped forward, holding the torch high and Longclaw at the ready in his other hand. The next chamber was immense, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. Pillars ran in 2 rows down the center, carved with twisting shapes that reminded him of dragons and dire wolves locked in some timeless struggle. The cold air pressed around him. Ghost let out a low growl that rumbled in the direwolf's throat, and then Jon heard it, a scraping sound from the darkness ahead. He paused, breath held. "Who goes there?" he whispered, although he doubted any living soul remained in these depths. The scraping repeated, followed by a faint rattling of metal. He pressed forward, each step cautious, his boots stirring dust that had lain undisturbed for countless years. The pillars' carvings seemed to shift in the flickering light, as though the stone creatures roiled to life. Then the torchlight caught something massive, a glimpse of iridescent darkness curled upon the stone floor. Scales, black and crimson, glinted dully. Chains of thick metal snaked across the form, pinning it in place. At first, Jon's mind struggled to accept what he saw. It was a dragon, so large that its tail vanished into the shadows of the chamber. Its wings were folded tight, and the metal bindings cut into the translucent membranes. A few scabbed injuries marred its hide. He could see the slow rise and fall of the creature's ribcage. It was alive. The beast shifted, its head turning slightly, revealing an elongated snout and 2 horns rising from the skull. The muzzle was muzzled shut with chain and metal straps. Ancient runes glimmered upon each link. Fear jolted through Jon like a blade of ice. Dragons in the north were myths. Even during the Targaryen conquests, no one had ever spoken of a dragon hidden under Winterfell. Yet here it lay, battered, breathing, and somehow subdued for countless years. Its great eyelids fluttered at the intrusion of the torchlight, and Jon caught the faint gleam of a reptilian pupil. The beast let out a muffled growl that vibrated through the floor, an echo of primal fury. He felt an overwhelming urge to run. He had no idea how a dragon had gotten here or how it had survived. Yet he also felt an inexplicable pull, as though something in his own blood answered the creature's presence. Perhaps it was the Targaryen side of him, awakened by proximity to a being of fire and scale. He could not leave it in this hellish confinement. Whoever had chained it must have had unimaginable power, or perhaps had used spells or runes to hold it. This was beyond him. Yet he could not bring himself to turn away. Jon approached slowly, raising the torch to see the links of chain. They were etched with glyphs he did not recognize, a mixture of Valyrian symbols and older runes that might date back to the children of the forest. The muzzle bridle was no less intricate, featuring plates of black iron inlaid with gold patterns. The dragon's breathing became more ragged as he neared, a note of deep warning in its throat. Ghost prowled to one side, ears pinned back, a low rumble in the direwolf's chest. Man and wolf stood before the impossible. Jon forced himself to speak in a calm, low tone, the way he might soothe a frightened horse. He doubted the dragon would understand, but his voice echoed in the chamber all the same. "It's all right," he said, not entirely certain it was. "I won't harm you." The dragon's eye glimmered, one was a dark red, as deep as garnets lit from within. Jon swallowed hard, feeling the surge of something older than even House Targaryen. A primal bond between man and beast, or perhaps it was an illusion formed by the flickering torchlight. He set the torch into a bracket on the nearest pillar, turning his gaze to the metal links that bound the dragon's forelimbs. They were the thickness of his wrist, hammered with runes, each link fitted so tightly the beast must have been in agony for centuries. He tested the chain with his sword, feeling the vibration that passed through Valyrian steel. A jolt of energy crackled along the metal, and the dragon jerked in response, letting out a muffled roar. The whole chamber shook, pebbles rattling from the vaulted ceiling. Jon steadied his breathing. He tried a small strike on one of the links binding a foreclaw, but the blow glanced off with sparks, leaving the runes intact. Magic was woven into these chains. It would not be a simple matter of hacking them loose. Realizing time was slipping away, Jon crouched, searching for a lock or weak point. He found something akin to a clasp, hammered shut with a rivet shaped like a direwolf's head. That gave him pause. Why would a relic of House Stark bind a dragon? That question unleashed 100 more. Perhaps it was from the Age of Heroes, or maybe from the days when Targaryens had yet to tame all their dragons. Jon felt the first stirrings of terror at the notion that his ancestors, both Stark and Targaryen, might have conspired to hide this creature away. Or maybe this had nothing to do with Targaryens. The runes might be older, created by sorcery unknown to living men. Ghost prowled behind him, whining. The dragon fixed its crimson gaze on Jon as if awaiting his decision. He swallowed his fear, though it remained lodged like a shard of ice in his chest, and gripped Longclaw's hilt with both hands. Gently, he set the blade's edge against the riveted clasp. He raised it and brought it down with all the force he could muster. A clang shot through his arms like lightning. The rivet buckled but did not break. One of the glyphs along the chain glowed faintly. The dragon jerked again, the muzzle straining against the rest of the harness. The runes flared a deep red, followed by a hiss of smoke as if the iron threatened to heat from within. Jon braced himself, heart hammering. If the chain erupted in some ancient curse, neither he nor Ghost might survive. But after a moment, the glow faded. Jon struck again. The rivet cracked, sending fragments of metal skittering across the stone. A portion of the chain loosened around the dragon's forelimb. The beast let out a low, startled grunt, the sound vibrating deep within its throat. Its pupil narrowed, but it did not thrash or snap at Jon. Instead, it lay still as if uncertain what came next. Jon realized he was drenched in sweat despite the biting cold. He set to work on the second rivet, the one securing the muzzle across the dragon's jaw. "You'll let me do this?" he whispered. He did not fully expect the dragon to understand, but an odd tension filled the air, as if the beast were aware that freedom was at hand and dared not disrupt the process. Jon struck the muzzle chain's rivet. Sparks flew. A faint red glow wreathed the iron. Then with a groan, the rivet gave way and the muzzle slackened around the scaled snout. For one terrifying second, Jon expected a jet of flame to engulf him. But the dragon merely opened its maw, letting out a rumble that echoed in the deep. It lifted its head a fraction, inhaling, stretching its jaws. Jon scrambled back, eyes wide, Longclaw at the ready in case it decided to sear him. Ghost tensed, ready to leap, though what a dire wolf could do against a living dragon Jon could not fathom. Yet the dragon did not attack. Instead, it turned its gaze upon Jon, nose quivering as if scenting him. He felt a brush against his mind, something intangible and powerful, gone in an instant like a whisper of wind. Then the creature exhaled a breath that smelled of ash and ancient stillness. Beneath that ash was a faint warmth, as though embers still smoldered within its belly despite the centuries. Though panic still thudded in his veins, Jon resumed, smashing other rivets on the chains across the dragon's chest and hind legs. Each blow threatened to unleash the arcane energies bound within the metal, but slowly, link by link, the shackles fell away. At last, with a thunderous rattle, a length of chain slipped from the dragon's body and smashed onto the stone floor. Freed from its restraint, the creature rose, standing on powerful limbs that trembled from disuse. Its wings unfurled partway, revealing tears in the membranes and scars older than Jon could imagine. When the beast tried to flap, only a stifled rustle echoed in the chamber, as if the dragon had forgotten how to use its own wings. Its tail swept slowly, stirring dust into a swirling cloud around them. Jon found himself stepping back until he was halfway behind a pillar, Ghost at his side. The dragon's head swung on a sinuous neck, taking in its surroundings. It bent to sniff the broken chains as though confirming the reality of its escape. Then it fixed Jon again with that terrible red eye, a sliver of molten color in an obsidian orb. The tension was so thick it choked him until the dragon emitted a guttural rumble that almost sounded like a question. He felt an insane desire to speak to it. "You're free," he said, voice shaking. "I don't know who did this to you, but no one deserves such a fate." The beast's gaze was unreadable, but it no longer growled. Jon moved away from the pillar, stepping slowly toward the archway that led back to the crypts. Part of him worried the dragon might attack now that it was no longer constrained. Another part felt that intangible pull, the sense that the creature recognized something in him. Could dragons sense Targaryen blood? Daenerys's dragons had responded to him once, albeit grudgingly, acknowledging something in his lineage that matched their own. This beast, however, was older, chained by a magic beyond anything he had seen. Would it accept him? Or simply burn him alive? As if in answer, the dragon lowered its head until its snout hovered near his chest. A warm gust of air wafted over him, carrying the stench of old cinders. He winced, bracing for a torrent of fire, but none came. Instead, the creature sniffed him, and a spark seemed to dance in its eye. It let out a low groan, somewhere between curiosity and pain. Jon's heart thundered. Cautiously, he reached out a trembling hand. His fingertips brushed against a scale near the creature's jaw, hard, ridged, faintly warm to the touch. A memory of something stirred within him, a sensation of forging a bond with an impossible beast. Then the dragon inhaled again, taking in his scent like a great cat might. Jon allowed his hand to rest on the ridge of the creature's brow. The dragon tilted its head slightly, exhaling its breath hot enough to make him recoil. Yet no harm came to him. When the moment broke, Jon felt as if an unspoken understanding had passed between them. "Come," he said, not sure if the dragon would follow or even comprehend. But as he turned toward the corridor leading out, the beast made a labored movement, flexing its wounded wings, and lumbered in his wake. Ghost warily padded at a safe distance, eyes fixed on the monstrous reptile. The corridor would be a tight fit, but if the dragon curled its wings, it could pass. With a quiet vow that he must be mad, Jon stepped through the iron gate he had forced, leading the dragon up the winding steps. Each footfall from the beast sent tremors through the stone, and Jon's mind spun with the question, how would he hide this? What would happen when the rest of Winterfell realized a living dragon had been sealed below their home? More importantly, how would the dragon react upon seeing the sky after so long? They passed the first lines of sarcophagi in the crypts. The dragon swung its head from side to side, sniffing the stale air. Ghost led a few paces in front now, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure that man and dragon still followed. Jon's pulse refused to slow. It felt like an eternity before they emerged into the main walkway of the crypts, and there the dragon paused to sniff at the statue of a Stark ancestor, its stone eyes gazing blankly forward. If the dragon remembered something, Jon could not tell. Its expression held only the savage dignity of an apex predator. It plodded up the final flight of stairs, forced to stoop low, wings folded in tight. At last they reached the heavy door that opened onto the courtyard. Jon took a moment to steel himself. This was madness, but he gripped the door's handle and shoved. The fresh air of Winterfell's night spilled in, crisp and cold, carrying the hush of moonlit snow. The moon was high, painting the courtyard in pale silver. The torchlight flickered around them. Jon stepped out first, quickly scanning for any guards. He saw no one. Sansa insisted on a schedule of patrols, but it seemed their corner was momentarily unguarded. Heart in his throat, Jon beckoned the dragon. It emerged with excruciating slowness, hind claws scraping the threshold, the tip of its tail just clearing the arch. Then it stood under the open sky for the first time in centuries. The courtyard was large, but not large enough for a dragon's comfort. The beast seemed to gaze at the towers, the ramparts, and the moonlit sky overhead with a mixture of awe and confusion. It stretched its wings tentatively. Jon heard bones pop and membranes crackle as if the creature's body was adjusting to freedom. Then it let out a deep, resonant bellow that shook the walls, raising an echo in the distant trees. Jon cringed. Every soul in Winterfell must have heard that. This moment could no longer be hidden. Within seconds, shouts rose around the castle. Figures appeared at the edges of the courtyard, men with spears and swords. Torches flared in the windows above. Jon turned, arms raised, as the guards rushed in. "Stay back," he cried. "Do not attack." His voice was swallowed by the clamor, but he repeated himself, stepping between the guards and the dragon. Ghost stood at his side, hackles raised but eyes calm, as if the direwolf trusted Jon's command. The dragon eyed the newcomers warily, letting out a puff of smoky breath. Its tail lashed once, gouging a chunk from a stone pillar. Arrows were knocked in an instant. "Hold your fire!" Jon roared, voice echoing in the courtyard. At the sight of him so close to the beast, many lowered their bows in confusion. Others glanced around as if expecting an order from Sansa or another Stark. Then, among the swirl of commotion, Sansa herself stepped through the assembled men, her cloak trailing in the snow. She looked as regal as any lady of Winterfell had ever been, but the shock on her face was unmistakable. "Jon," she said, voice low with astonishment. "What in the name of the old gods is this?" "A dragon," Jon said, stating the obvious with a shaky laugh that held no real humor. "It was chained beneath the crypts. I set it free." Her eyes flicked from him to the towering reptile whose head lifted above the parapets. The dragon was weakened, emaciated, but still a sight of terrible wonder. Sansa's face went pale. "Chained? Beneath Winterfell?" She glanced at the crypt door, horror dawning. "For how long?" "I don't know." Jon lowered his arms slightly, though he kept one hand splayed toward the dragon as though to calm it. "But it's free now. The guards mustn't attack it. It's not our enemy, not unless we force it to be." The men looked to Sansa for guidance, then back to Jon, uncertain. The hush that fell was electric. No one dared move. Then a new voice cut through the tension, Bran's voice, serene, neither loud nor soft. It was hidden during the darkest days when the North warred with dragons of the South, he said, seated in a wheeled chair near the courtyard's edge. How he'd arrived so silently, no one seemed to know. His pale eyes stared at the dragon without fear, as if seeing through it into the far reaches of the past. There were secrets buried here, under crypts older than the castle itself. The knowledge was lost. He spoke in a flat, dreamlike tone, as was his way now. Sansa's expression was torn between disbelief and the reality standing before her. She spoke carefully, as if addressing both Jon and the anxious guards. "No one attacks," she said. "No one draws a bow or points a spear. Jon, can you control it?" Jon shook his head. "I don't know if control is the word, but it seems to know me." His connection to the dragon felt tenuous, yet there was a link, a sense that the beast recognized something in him. "We can't keep it here in the courtyard. It needs space and a reason not to burn the castle down." Sansa took a slow breath, pressing her lips into a thin line. "If it wanted to kill us, it would have done so already, I suppose." She eyed the dragon's battered form. "It's injured. It needs help." Jon turned, concern rising in him. He studied the tears in the wings, the raw spots where chains had bitten into flesh. Beneath the dragon's formidable presence lay deep weakness. For all he knew, it had not eaten in an age. If dragons needed regular nourishment, how had it survived? "We'll have to find a way to feed it," he said, though the idea was daunting. Winterfell's supplies were carefully rationed, even in times of relative peace. "And we need to keep everyone safe." Bran's voice drifted again. "The Godwood might be a safe place for now. It's enclosed and guarded by the walls, with space enough for the dragon to rest without threatening the entire castle." Jon considered the suggestion, nodding. "We can try. It might prefer the open air, but the Godwood is large and quiet." Sansa signaled to the guards to form a wide perimeter. Slowly, carefully, they escorted the dragon around the outer walkway beyond the courtyard. The beast lumbered on trembling limbs, leaving monstrous footprints in the snow. When it finally reached the Godswood gate, it paused, letting out a soft hiss. The old weirwood tree within stood stark white in the moonlight, its red leaves like drops of blood. The dragon regarded it warily. Bran murmured from his chair at the threshold, "Let it see we mean no harm." Jon stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the dragon's neck. The creature's scales felt cold, but beneath them, Jon sensed the flicker of heat from its belly. The dragon allowed him to guide it into the Godwood, where it curled around the clearing near the heart tree, tail wrapping over its feet. Steam rose from its nostrils, each breath causing small eddies in the snow. The guards slowly withdrew, leaving only Jon, Sansa, Arya, who had appeared silently beside her sister, and Bran. Arya's expression was one of unmasked awe. She had seen many strange things, survived the worst of men and magic alike, but even she wore a look of stunned disbelief. The sword at her hip was sheathed, but her hand rested on the pommel. Jon couldn't blame her wariness. He still trembled inside, each movement stiff with adrenaline. The dragon tucked its head low, exhaling. Its wings folded awkwardly, broken membranes shifting in the faint moonlight. Something about its posture looked more exhausted than triumphant. If it had once been a terrifying weapon, it was now a battered echo of that power. Jon felt a pang of empathy, remembering how he had felt chained by duty and burdens that weren't of his choosing. Sansa cleared her throat. "I'll have the maesters examine it, but discreetly. We don't want the entire North in panic. Rumors will spread, of course, but we can at least try to manage them." "Let the rumors come," Arya said, glancing up at the enormous reptile. Winterfell has survived worse. Yet she kept her tone subdued, as if still in shock. Bran eyed the creature. "We must learn its name." Jon looked at him sharply. "Dragons have names, yes, but how would we?" "It knows its name," Bran said cryptically, eyes distant. "There may be a way to glean it through the old magic." Jon didn't pretend to understand all that Bran had become. But if the young man, claimed he could do it, Jon would let him try. "We should see what can be done for its wounds first," Jon said, looking at the raw spots where the chains had cut. Fresh blood oozed from one deep gouge in the wing. "Maester Walgrave can prepare ointments for infection. And we need to feed it. Well, something." He frowned. "We have livestock in the pastures, but not an overabundance. Still, it must eat." Sansa nodded. "Better to sacrifice a few animals than risk it deciding to hunt on its own. I'll see it done." They worked quickly. Servants arrived in hushed awe, bringing bandages, basins of hot water, and pails of salve. Others arrived with a cart carrying the carcasses of 2 sheep. The guards kept a wary distance while a few brave souls helped Jon approach the dragon and attempt to cleanse its wounds. It remained still and watchful, wincing occasionally from the pressure of cloths on raw flesh. When the carcasses were presented, it eyed them for a long moment, then tore into the meat with savage hunger. Bones snapped loudly, and the men and women in attendance recoiled at the sight of the dragon's glistening fangs. Jon stood close, marveling at the creature's resilience and ferocity. He recalled seeing Dany's dragons eat, but they had been smaller then, or at least more familiar. This one was something ancient, a secret locked beneath the ground for ages. As it devoured the second sheep, he felt an odd gratitude that it hadn't turned that appetite upon the living inhabitants of Winterfell. When at last the dragon settled, full and weary, it coiled its neck and closed its eyes, a wave of relief washing over Jon. Sansa asked the guards to keep watch around the perimeter, instructing them not to provoke the beast. Bran lingered, hands on the wooden arms of his chair, eyes half-lidded as if he was listening to something only he could hear. Arya slipped away at some point, as silent as she'd arrived. Jon found himself slumping against a tree trunk, exhaustion hitting him all at once. Ghost lay at his feet, the direwolf's keen gaze fixed on the slumbering dragon. Somewhere beyond the Godswood walls, Winterfell stirred with confusion. The courtyard would be abuzz with talk of the monstrous visitor. He wondered how the lords of the north would respond to this new presence. Dragons were emblematic of the Targaryen conquest, symbols of southern might. The north had never forgotten the harshness of that subjugation, and now a dragon reappeared from its hidden tomb. He had no illusions about the trouble that might follow, but for now, he felt only relief that the beast was no longer in chains. He sat there for a long time, the chill of the night air seeping through his cloak. His mind whirled with questions. Who had bound a dragon beneath Winterfell? How had it survived? Why had the crypts remained silent about its existence for so many generations? Was this linked somehow to his own heritage, his Targaryen blood calling to a dragon trapped in the land of the Starks? He thought of his father, Eddard Stark, or the man he believed was his father for so long, and silently asked for guidance. But the wind in the Godwood carried only the faint rustle of leaves, the groan of ancient branches. Eventually, Sansa approached him, her cloak pulled tight against the cold. Her face was weary but resolved. The maesters have done what they can. The dragon's wings will need time to heal, if they can. Those are old wounds set badly. Some tears might never mend properly. But at least it's not dying. She crouched beside Jon, her breath a white cloud. We must decide what to do with it, Jon. We can't simply keep it in the Godwood forever. He massaged the bridge of his nose. We'll figure something out. But for tonight, let it rest. We'll keep it fed, keep it calm. If it's going to stay, it must learn we're not its enemies. She glanced at the dragon's sleeping form, its massive flank rising and falling. Let's hope it sees that in time. And let's hope our people can accept it. Jon nodded. Sansa squeezed his shoulder, then rose, heading back to oversee the castle. Jon remained a while longer, staring at the beast whose arrival had already shifted the balance of life in Winterfell. In the shadows of the Godwood, Bran's chair creaked as he moved closer. The boy regarded Jon with those keen, distant eyes. You heard it calling, Bran said softly. Jon looked up. I dreamed of it. Did you know it was there? A flicker of sorrow touched Bran's features. I saw echoes in the past, but it was jumbled, blurred. There was a ward placed around its prison, some magic older than me, older than men. I could only sense fragments. The stories said a Targaryen once tried to claim the North centuries after the conquest. But the North resisted, and somehow this dragon was captured. The direwolf runes and the old magic of the children kept it sealed away. Time forgot it. Perhaps it was safer that way. Jon ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. But it survived. Locked in darkness. Bran's gaze slipped to the sleeping dragon. Hate and sorrow can keep something alive for a very long time, Jon. Now that it's free, the land itself may be unsettled. The old wards are broken. What does that mean? Bran closed his eyes. It means we should be prepared for consequences. The North has secrets. We've learned that many times over. Jon shivered, not just from the cold. Well, it's done. We can only move forward now. He looked at the dragon again, feeling that faint tug in his blood, an almost gravitational pull. We'll do what we must. Bran nodded, though his expression gave little away. With that, Jon finally stood, Ghost rising alongside him. Bran wheeled himself off toward the gate, leaving Jon alone with the sleeping behemoth. He let out one last shaky breath and then followed, stepping from the godwood into the labyrinth of corridors leading to the Great Keep. The hour was late and the hush around him carried tension and rumors behind closed doors. He could almost hear the fearful whispers, "A dragon? In Winterfell?" He took a short meal in the kitchen and then retired to his chamber, mind spinning too fiercely to hope for real rest. When sleep finally claimed him, he dreamed again of the crypts, of flame bursting in the darkness, of chains melting under an onslaught of dragon fire. He dreamed he stood with a sword of burning light, commanding legions of the dead to stop their advance, only to see a dire wolf and a dragon side by side, howling and roaring in tandem. The vision swirled, shifting into the voice of something ancient calling his name, Targaryen, Stark, both and neither. He awoke at dawn, unrefreshed, the embers in his fireplace nearly out. He dressed quickly and made his way back to the godswood, half expecting to find the dragon gone or the watchers dead. Instead, he found the beast awake but calm, its tail thumping lazily in the snow, steam rising from its nostrils. The watchers, some men, some women, looked bleary-eyed but unscathed. A half-eaten carcass of another sheep lay near the dragon's claws. It raised its head as Jon approached, letting out a noise that was neither growl nor roar, more like a rumble of recognition. Ghost bounded ahead, stopping just short of the dragon's snout as if the direwolf might become a morsel if it misstepped. But the dragon merely regarded Ghost, then Jon. He dared to move closer, placing a hand on its rough scales again. The dragon's eye flicked to him. He felt that wave of awe wash over him once more. A living dragon in Winterfell, as though the world had gone mad. But the chill morning air was real enough. Snow drifted from the boughs above, landing in silent flurries around the old godwood. The red leaves of the weirwood tree rustled as if conferring among themselves. Moments later, Bran arrived with a maester whose arms were laden with scrolls. They set themselves up near the heart tree, unrolling parchment covered in runes and sigils. Bran closed his eyes, one hand splayed on the trunk of the weirwood. The maester lit a brazier, the smoke mingling with the dragon's exhalations. Jon watched from a respectful distance as Bran tried to glean some fragment of the dragon's history or perhaps its name. From time to time, the boy murmured words that sounded like bits of an old language, possibly Valyrian or something even older. The dragon watched with a slow, blinking stare, as if aware it was being scrutinized. Jon felt useless, standing there with no knowledge of magic. He was a man of action, a swordsman, a soldier. This was a different arena entirely. So he settled for calm vigilance, ensuring none of the watchers panicked. The wind picked up, stirring the branches overhead. Occasionally, the dragon shifted, letting out soft huffs of breath that stank of blood and old ashes. The maester scribbled notes. Hours passed. Bran finally opened his eyes, blinking as though returning from a great distance. He said a few words to the maester, who nodded and carefully replaced the scrolls. Then Bran beckoned Jon over. "Its name is Erix's," Bran said softly. "Or something close to that. The language is old and the name twisted by centuries of captivity. But that is the closest word. Erix's, the Ashen Wyrm. Erix's," Jon repeated, testing the sound on his tongue. He turned to the dragon. "So you have a name." The beast tilted its head as if responding to the word. "What else did you learn?" Bran's face was pale with strain. It was bound by Stark ancestors in a pact with certain northern houses and others. The reason is unclear, but it seems Erix's was a threat, perhaps rampaging or set loose by an old Targaryen claimant. The Northerners used blood sorcery and the help of the children of the forest to trap it, to protect the land. It said Erix's burned a swath of the Wolfswood, killing thousands. He was unstoppable until the old spells were invoked. They sealed him beneath the crypts, a punishment for his fury, or maybe a means of containing a power they couldn't destroy outright. Bran glanced at the dragon's wounds. He was not always so large or so battered, but centuries in captivity. Well, it seems a twisted form of magic was used to keep him alive, half-starving, imprisoned in a sort of suspended state. A fate worse than death, I'd say. Jon's throat tightened at the horror of it. Then we've unleashed a weapon upon the north. Bran shook his head. It's more complicated. Erix's is bound to the land itself in some way. And now to you. The old wards recognized your Targaryen blood, but also your Stark blood. It might be the reason you were able to break the chains. Jon felt the hairs on his neck rise. He thought of how easily the dream had led him down there, how the chain's runes had blazed but not killed him. Perhaps the duality in his heritage was a key. Is Erix's, does it still harbor that ancient fury? Bran's gaze drifted to the beast. He's capable of it, certainly. But he's also endured a torment no living creature should face. Whether that makes him kinder or more vengeful, I can't say. The old magic that once bound him is gone. Now, it's up to us to guide what happens next. Jon exhaled slowly. We'll feed him, tend his wounds, try to earn his trust. But the lords of the north will clamor for answers. They already are, Sansa said from behind them. She'd arrived quietly, listening to Bran's explanation. Her face held a stern resolve. We can't hide this for long. In fact, it's probably best that we don't hide it at all. We must show them that Winterfell has the situation under control. Jon nodded. We can hold a gathering here. Let them see the dragon isn't our enemy. But they'll demand to know what we plan to do with it. And the truth is, we don't know. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking at Erix's, whose head rose above them like a dark hill. Dragons were never meant to be caged. He's too large to keep here indefinitely. If he can't fly properly with those damaged wings, then what becomes of him? Bran's voice was quiet. There might be a way to heal, partially at least. Time and care could help. But if the tears are too deep, Erix's may never soar as he once did. He might remain here, landbound. Jon felt an unexpected pang. He recalled the majesty of Daenerys's dragons in flight, the thunder of their wing beats across the sky. A dragon grounded, forced to remain in one place, was a tragic notion. We'll do what we can, Jon said, though uncertainty gnawed at him. If he chooses to leave once he's strong enough, we can't stop him. Sansa's eyes flicked to Erix's. Let's pray he shows mercy to us if he does. Days passed, each filled with a peculiar rhythm. The news spread across Winterfell and beyond, stirring astonishment and fear. Lords arrived to witness the dragon with their own eyes, some demanding it be destroyed, others standing at a distance with a mixture of awe and dread. Sansa held her council in the Great Hall, deftly maintaining order, reminding the lords that an attack on a wounded dragon might provoke chaos. Jon stood beside her, fielding questions about how this came to be. He told the truth as best he could, that something ancient lay chained beneath Winterfell and that he, by some combination of fortune and heritage, had freed it. Sansa framed it as an act of both necessity and compassion. No living creature should be left in torment. The lords were not entirely mollified. Some muttered about Targaryen influences. Others grumbled about the possible wrath of an awakened monster. Yet no one dared make an open move against the dragon, not with Jon Snow and the Lady of Winterfell protecting it, and certainly not with the memory of how swiftly dragons could annihilate armies. The North still bore scars from the wars of the recent past. Despite the hostility, for the moment, uneasy peace held. Meanwhile, Erix's resided in the Godwood, devouring sheep and the occasional goat, forming a small mountain of bones near the weir. Wood's base. Though servants diligently carted them away when the dragon napped. The maesters continued to treat his injuries. He seemed to tolerate their presence, though he would occasionally snap his jaws to remind them of his power. In the evenings, Jon would sit in the clearing, occasionally reading old texts about dragons, trying to make sense of the runic wards. Ghost often accompanied him, lying a short distance away, ears alert. Erix's watched from half-lidded eyes, occasionally letting out soft rumbles as though to converse. Jon felt no direct telepathy or anything as fabled as the dragon bond, but there was a measure of understanding. He could sense the dragon's mood, its pain or its contentment. Perhaps it was the Targaryen blood, or perhaps it was something else entirely. On the 5th night after Erix's awakening, Jon found himself alone in the Godswood, the watchers dismissed for a shift change. The sky was dark, clouds blotting out the moon and stars, the hush of midnight raining. Snow drifted lazily, settling on the dragon's scales. Erix's let out a quiet huff, melting the flakes before they could blanket his wounded wings. Jon knelt by the roots of the weirwood, lost in thought. He looked at the carved face in the trunk, the red sap forming tears that glistened in the darkness. I used to think the hardest part was fighting the living dead, he murmured to the old gods, to the face in the tree. But perhaps the real challenge is living afterward, carrying all the knowledge and burdens that remain. He glanced at the dragon, who watched him silently. Sometimes, I wonder if I should have stayed dead. It was a grim thought, but honest. The war had weighed on him. The revelations of his parentage had weighed on him. Now, the presence of this ancient creature threatened new turmoil. He feared not only for the North's safety, but for his own uncertain heart. Erix's exhaled, a warm gust that parted the snow around Jon. Without truly planning to, Jon stood and walked closer, placing a hand gently on the dragon's forelimb. The beast's eye flicked open fully, the pupil narrowed, focusing on Jon. A rumble resonated deep in Erix's chest, and for a moment, Jon worried he had overstepped. But then the dragon let out a softer sound, a half growl, half purr. Jon felt the vibration against his palm, felt like acceptance or perhaps a warning. It was hard to tell with dragons. "You've seen more winters than any of us," Jon said softly. "Survived them, chained in the dark. I can't imagine your rage." The dragon blinked, tail twitching in the snow. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us. But for whatever it's worth, I am sorry for what was done to you." A single plume of smoke curled from Erix's nostrils, floating up into the night. The gods fell silent again, apart from the faint rustling of branches in the wind. Jon thought of Daenerys, her fierce spirit, her bond with Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion. He wondered what she would say if she stood here, face to face with a dragon older than her own line. Perhaps she would have known how to soothe Erix's. Or perhaps her longing for the Iron Throne would have driven her to claim him as a weapon. Jon felt only the desire to heal old wounds, to prevent more bloodshed. So the days turned into weeks, and slowly Winterfell adapted to the presence of an ancient dragon. Some of the tension even faded as people realized Erix's was not laying waste to the castle. Indeed, the dragon rarely stirred from the god would accept to eat or to stretch painfully in the courtyard. Children began sneaking peeks from the battlements, breathless with excitement. The older generation viewed the creature with suspicion or outright dread. Yet no one dared provoke it. When the first real storm of the season descended, howling winds and sheets of snow hammered the castle. Jon feared the cold might worsen Erix's injuries, but the dragon seemed unfazed. Snow-caked his scales, he shook it off with a casual shrug of his wings. A swirl of heat surrounded him at times as if his inner fire staved off the chill. Nevertheless, Jon insisted on extra care. The maesters and stable hands built a makeshift windbreak using large wooden barriers around part of the godwood, so the dragon would have shelter from the fiercest gusts. Erix's tolerated this fussing, though he would sometimes huff clouds of steam to let them know he found it unnecessary. Throughout this time, Jon and Erix's developed a tentative rapport. Jon could approach and even touch the dragon's snout without immediate fear of being bitten. Erix's seemed to recognize Jon's presence as something other than threat or prey, though the trust remained fragile. Jon tested whether the dragon would allow him to examine the wings, carefully lifting a tattered membrane or checking a scar. Erix's would growl, but let him do it. The tears in the membranes were formidable, likely permanent, but the infection had receded under careful treatment. Whatever flight the dragon might manage one day, if at all, would be partial at best. Meanwhile, political tensions rose. Ravens arrived bearing messages of alarm or curiosity. Some northern houses demanded a council to decide the dragon's fate. Others wanted reassurance that the creature would not ravage their lands. Sansa took the lead, skillfully replying that the dragon was convalescing under Winterfell's watch and that it was no threat if not provoked. She pointed to Jon as the sole figure Erix's recognized. They must rely on his connection with the beast. Some responded with skepticism, but none sought open conflict yet. On a frigid morning after the storm had passed, Jon found Sansa waiting for him by the old well in the courtyard. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, her auburn hair braided around her fur-lined hood. She had the look of someone carrying significant news. "Jon," she greeted him, voice just above a whisper. He bowed his head in acknowledgement. "Sansa, is something wrong?" She glanced around to ensure they were alone, then spoke quietly. "Lord Serwyn, Lord Glover, and others have pushed for a gathering of Northern Bannermen here at Winterfell. They want to see the dragon for themselves and judge its danger. I've acquiesced. Better to have them come here, under a roof, than allow rumors to fester." Jon's stomach twisted. "When?" "In 5 days' time. We'll prepare rooms, hold a feast, and arrange a formal audience with Erix's. We should present him in a controlled manner. Show the lords he isn't some mindless beast, nor a puppet in your hands." Jon exhaled. "I'll be there, of course. But if the lords decide the dragon is a threat, they might press for it to be killed." Sansa's gaze hardened. "We won't allow that. Erix's is under Stark protection now, as far as I'm concerned. If any lord attempts violence, we'll stand in their way. But we must tread carefully. We can't risk a civil war over this." The notion of conflict over the dragon made Jon's blood run cold. He nodded grimly. "We'll do what we must." Preparations began. The staff at Winterfell bustled, setting rooms in order, preparing supplies. Sansa carefully curated the feast, mindful of limited resources but determined to display hospitality. The yard buzzed with speculation. Some men hammered together additional fencing around the godwood to provide a vantage point for the visiting lords without letting them get too close to Eryx's. Jon increased the guard rotations, worried that someone might try to slip in and harm the dragon under cover of night. He spent even more time in the godswood, ensuring Eryx's stayed calm and well-fed. As the day approached, the winter skies turned a dull gray as though reflecting the tension building within the castle walls. Lords arrived in sledges, on horseback, in wagons, their banners snapping in the wind. House Serwyn, House Glover, House Mormont, House Tallheart, and others, each representing a piece of the northern tapestry. They gathered in the great hall, stamping snow from their boots, breathing clouds of frost into the air. The feasting was subdued, conversation dominated by speculation about the dragon. Many peered at Jon curiously, as though he were now some exotic wonder himself, a Targaryen bastard who commanded a monstrous reptile. After the meal, the lords were led to the godwood. The paths had been cleared of snow, lanterns strung from branches to provide light in the mid-afternoon gloom. Eryx's waited by the heart tree, tail swishing in the snow, his scales dotted with white flakes. A fresh kill, an elk from the local huntsman, lay partially devoured. The stench of blood thickened the air. The lords paused, some gasping at the sight. A few reached for the hilts of their swords, but the Winterfell guards swiftly dissuaded them with cautionary looks. Jon stood in front of Eryx's, hand resting gently on the dragon's forelimb. Despite his outward calm, his heart pounded. If the dragon decided to lash out, the resulting carnage would be horrendous. Yet Eryx's seemed more curious than hostile. The lords, on the other hand, wore expressions ranging from fear to grim determination. Lord Glover cleared his throat. "We've heard talk of this monster. Now we see it with our own eyes." He spat in the snow. "The north is no place for dragons. Shouldn't we rid ourselves of this burden before it becomes a terror?" Murmurs of agreement arose from several corners. Sansa stepped forward, voice firm. "Eryx's is not our enemy. He's wounded, half-starved from centuries of captivity beneath our own castle. Jon has freed him and nursed him. Thus far, he's harmed no one, save for a few sheep. And that was at our bidding to feed him." Lord Serwyn shook his head. "You speak as if it's a wild hound that can be tamed. Dragons are destructive by nature. We all remember the stories of the Field of Fire and the burning of Harrenhal. Are we to trust that this beast won't reduce our homes to cinders?" Jon stepped in, voice level. "Eryx's has the capacity for destruction, yes. But so does any sword or any army. He's not mindless. He recognizes who helped free him and who tends his wounds. I understand your fears. Truly I do. But if we kill him now, what does that say of our honor? We kept him chained in darkness for centuries. He was never given a chance to live freely. And he has done no harm since emerging." The lords exchanged uneasy looks. Lord Glover sniffed. "And who is to say he won't unleash his fire once he recovers fully?" Eryx's let out a guttural rumble at that moment, whether in response to the tense voices or simply because he sensed the scrutiny. Several lords recoiled. One man flinched as though to draw his weapon, but a Winterfell guard seized his wrist. Jon frowned. This was the delicate balance he had dreaded. Sansa held up a hand, commanding attention. "We are aware of the risk. That's why we are prepared to accept all responsibility for the dragon. House Stark will see to his well-being and ensure he poses no threat to your lands. Should he threaten any holdfast, Winterfell will intervene." She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle. "The North stands together, or it falls. Let us stand on honor, not fear." Lord Glover eyed Jon, then the dragon. After a tense silence, he sighed. "The North remembers, indeed. This is not something we can simply ignore. But if House Stark will vouch for the beast, then so be it. We'll hold you accountable, Jon Snow. If this dragon turns on the North, I'll hold you personally responsible." Jon nodded, meeting his gaze. "I accept that burden. I will do everything in my power to prevent harm to our people." A murmur rippled through the gathering. Some nodded, others looked uncertain or grim. But none stepped forward to press for an immediate execution. The presence of the Stark guards, and possibly the imposing sight of Eryx's himself, kept them from pushing the matter. Slowly, the tension eased, replaced by a cautious acceptance that this was the new reality. A dragon lived at Winterfell, under Stark protection. The lords dispersed, though their whispers remained. In the aftermath, Jon felt an odd mixture of relief and exhaustion. Sansa placed a hand on his arm. "That went about as well as it could have," she said softly. "You were persuasive, Jon." He shook his head. "They still fear him. That fear may fester." She sighed. "Yes, we must show them that Eryx's can be a protector, not just a threat." Perhaps over time, if he keeps to himself and causes no harm, their fear will recede. Jon glanced back at Erix's, who shifted his bulk, half-lidding his eyes. "I hope so," he said quietly. Several more weeks passed. Winter deepened, blanketing the castle and surrounding lands in white. The winds howled, sometimes forcing everyone inside except the watch rotations. Erix's remained in the Godswood or occasionally ventured to the courtyard to bask by the blacksmith's forge heat. It was a surreal sight, the forge's smoke mingling with the dragon's breath. Jon continued caring for him, forging a cautious bond. The battered wings began to heal in places, but the more severe tears remained. Whenever Erix's stretched them, a painful groan escaped his throat, and he would sink back down, frustration evident in the lash of his tail. One evening, when the storms were at their worst, Jon found himself pacing near the great hall's hearth. Outside, ice pelted the walls. Ghost lay curled nearby, ears twitching. Jon's mind dwelled on the rumors swirling in the keep. Rumors that a faction of lords still wanted the dragon gone, that others eyed Jon with suspicion, calling him dragon bastard or the Targaryen wolf. He tried to dismiss such talk, but it persisted like an itch beneath his armor. Eventually, he decided to visit Erix's to ensure the makeshift shelter remained intact. He trudged through the wind-whipped corridors, pulling his cloak tight around him. Snow stung his face as he stepped into the courtyard. The flicker of lanterns provided minimal illumination, revealing heaps of drifted snow. Guards shivered at their posts. Jon crossed into the Godswood, the old gate rattling behind him. The swirl of wind lessened somewhat among the trees, the air thick with swirling flakes. He called softly to Erix's, though the wind swallowed much of his voice. He found the dragon curled beside the wooden barriers, a silent mountain of scales. Steam rose from his nostrils in the frigid air. At Jon's approach, Erix's stirred, lifting his head. A slow blink, as if acknowledging his presence. Snow had piled over the dragon's back, but he seemed only mildly inconvenienced. Jon brushed some of it off, muttering about the storm's ferocity. Erix's let out a low hum, as though in agreement. And then Jon saw something in Erix's eyes, a flash of restlessness, maybe even sadness. The dragon shifted his wings, testing their span in the swirling snow. The left membrane had partially mended, but the right bore a huge scar. Even if flight was possible, it would be painfully limited. Erix's let out a throaty groan, bowing his head, a plume of smoke escaping his jaws. Jon felt an unexpected pang of sympathy, thinking of how humiliating it must be for a dragon to be grounded by old wounds. He placed a hand gently on the nearest forelimb. The scaled surface was warm despite the winter air. Erix's eye flicked toward him. "No one should be caged," Jon said quietly, the words lost in the roar of the wind. "We'll find a way if there is one." He couldn't promise more. But in that moment, standing in the heart of a storm, man and dragon shared a silent accord. Both had been chained in their own ways, and both yearned for freedom. Sometime around the dawn of the next day, the storm finally relented. The sky cleared to a pale winter sun. Jon helped the servants clear pathways, hauling snow aside. They fed Erix's 3 goats, which he devoured quickly. The day fell into an uneasy calm. Sansa worked on the endless duties of running the castle. Arya came and went like a ghost. Bran studied old texts, and Jon checked the perimeter while wrestling with his own thoughts. That evening, as dusk descended, Jon stood on the ramparts, watching the sun vanish behind a horizon of ice and fir trees. A hush settled over Winterfell. He stared at the swirl of violet and gold along the sky's edge. Part of him wondered if the threat of more war was only a matter of time. Yet for the moment, there was peace. Behind him, the towers of Winterfell rose, lights glowing in the windows. Beneath him, the courtyard stretched, and beyond that, the Godwood where Erix's rested, cradled by drifting snow and the centuries-old heart tree. Jon allowed himself a moment of stillness. He remembered the earliest days when all he had known was the quiet sense of being a bastard among true-born lords and ladies, uncertain of his future. Now he bore the weight of a dragon's fate, of the North's fragile trust, and a heritage that straddled fire and ice. Yet in that quiet, he felt no regret for freeing Erix's. Darkness and torment served no good purpose in a world already scarred by war. Perhaps, in time, the North could learn to abide a dragon's presence, and perhaps Erix's could learn that not all men sought to bind him in chains. Ghost padded beside him, pressing a soft muzzle against his leg. He absently stroked the direwolf's fur, lost in reflection. The memory of ancient roars in the crypts lingered, but they were now replaced by the real, living thunder of Eryx's breath in the godwood. Sometimes, late at night, Jon heard a distant rumble from that direction, a dragon's unsettled dreaming. Before heading inside, Jon cast one final glance at the darkening sky, thinking of the old songs of dragons and dire wolves, of ice and fire. Such tales felt insubstantial next to the reality of an ancient beast lying wounded behind the walls of Winterfell. And yet, this moment felt like a new story being born, its course uncertain. Perhaps it was a story of redemption, of freeing what was chained and forging bonds where there was once only enmity. Or perhaps it was the prelude to another conflict. Jon could not see the shape of things to come, only the fragile truth of the present. Eryx lived, free from his prison, and the North, for the time being, endured his presence. He took a deep breath of the icy air. Then he turned and descended the stairs. The long night of winter would continue, and with it the uneasy alliance between a secret dragon once buried in darkness and the people of the North who had inadvertently become his keepers. Step by step, Jon Snow walked back into Winterfell, bearing the weight of all that had been and all that might yet be, determined to see it through, no matter what the cost. The hush of fresh snow muffled his footsteps, leaving only the echo of his resolve to guide him forward into whatever fate awaited. Jon Snow stood on the ramparts of Winterfell as another dawn broke over a landscape of unrelenting white. The snowfall had lessened in the last day, and the early sun painted the battlements in fragile gold light that gleamed off icicles clinging to the stone. Steam rose from the castle kitchens below, hinting at fresh bread and stew, but Jon hardly noticed. He leaned against the cold stone, letting a pale wind ruffle his hair. He still wore black more often than not, a habit he had never truly given up since his days at the Wall, but he no longer took orders from anyone in that order. In a world increasingly torn between caution and hope, he felt caught between those same two impulses. An ancient dragon slumbered in the godwood, and the North did not yet know whether to celebrate or fear its presence. Beyond the gates, new drifts of snow had piled against the outer walls. Guards patrolled in pairs, boots crunching loudly with each step. Winterfell's banners, adorned with the stark dire wolf, fluttered in a brittle wind that carried echoes of the past. The yard below bustled with stable hands, blacksmiths, and servants preparing for the day's tasks. Over the last few weeks, trade caravans had come and gone, curiosity about the so-called Winterfell dragon spreading across the region. Word traveled quickly along the King's Road, and Jon knew it wouldn't be long before even those in the south would learn of Eryx's. Whether they would leave the North to handle its own affairs was another question entirely. He gazed out over the white horizon, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. Sansa wanted more eyes and ears on the roads leading north, worried some opportunists might try to steal or even slay the dragon to curry favor with powerful lords. That was an unthinkable notion, but not an impossible one. Dragons had always had a target on their backs, especially among those who believed they threatened the old balance of power. Jon glanced down into the courtyard. People carried on with their daily chores, but the hush of subdued awe lingered. Every once in a while, a whisper made the rounds, "That's Jon Snow, the one who freed the dragon." Or, "He's as much Targaryen as Stark. Look at that hair. Look at those eyes. He tamed a beast of fire." Jon tried to ignore the talk. It only reinforced the sense that he stood apart, different from those who claimed to be wholly of the North. Before too long, he turned and descended the stairs. Ghost padded at his side, silent but watchful. The interior corridors were warmer, with tapestries and rush torches lending color and glow to the stone walls. He passed guards in stark livery, offering them a brief nod. Servants hurried by, arms laden with firewood or sacks of flour. Jon slipped through the winding hallways until he reached the broad doors leading to the godwood. He paused to greet the sentries posted there, 2 men from House Mormont, both looking half-frozen despite their thick cloaks. He thanked them for their diligence, then stepped outside. The godwood greeted him with a hush that felt almost sacred. Towering trees, their branches crusted with snow, encircled the clearing. The heart tree, the ancient weirwood with its eerie carved face, rose in the center. Red leaves quivered in the faint breeze, like drops of blood against the expanse of white. And near the trunk, sprawled on a bed of partially trodden snow, lay Eryx's. The dragon stirred at Jon's approach, lifting its tapered head and blinking. The old injuries on its wings had improved slightly, the tears were no longer raw or infected, but they remained a patchwork of scarring that would never fully vanish. Where the membranes had knit together, thick ridges of grayish tissue formed, an uneven tapestry of old flesh. Eryx's black and crimson scales glinted dully in the morning light, dusted with frost. Steam rose from its nostrils, visible even at a distance, coiling in the frigid air. Jon advanced carefully, his boots crunching over snow that had refrozen overnight. Ghost trotted ahead, giving the dragon a wide berth, though they had reached a point of mutual acceptance. Eryx recognized Ghost's scent just as he recognized Jon's, and no longer rumbled in threatening displeasure when the dire wolf drew near. Jon lifted a hand, calling out in a low voice, "Eryx." The dragon blinked, a slow, deliberate movement of its lidless eyes. It uttered a noise halfway between a groan and a rumble, the sound vibrating through Jon's boots. For all its size and ferocity, the creature's posture was oddly subdued. In the weeks since Jon had freed it, the dragon had shown no signs of aggression toward the people of Winterfell beyond the obvious threat-laden growls when startled. Jon had half expected some impulsive act of violence, but Eryx was content to rest, to accept the nourishment and healing the Starks offered. Perhaps centuries of captivity had sapped the creature's will to destroy. Or perhaps it harbored resentments too deep to surface, lying dormant like a hidden fault line. Jon could not say. What he did know was that the dragon responded to him with something like guarded acceptance, as if it recognized a fellow outcast. He approached and placed a hand on the dragon's forelimb. The scale felt cold to the touch, though beneath that layer, Jon sensed the faint heat thrumming from within. "Morning," he said softly, though it felt absurd to speak so familiarly to a beast of legend. Eryx shifted, letting out a gust of warm breath. That breath smelled of old ashes and the iron tang of raw meat. Nearby, Jon saw the remains of a deer carcass, the kill from last night's feeding. Bones stuck out of the snow, picked nearly clean. It still unsettled him, seeing the pure savagery of draconic feeding, but he reminded himself that this was natural for such a predator. The maesters kept close track of the livestock offered to Eryx's, ensuring Winterfell's stores were not depleted beyond reason. So far, the arrangement held. Jon slid his hand along the edge of a large scale, checking for any sign of cracking in the cold. He spoke in a low, soothing tone, though he suspected the words meant less than the calm of his presence. "The storm's passed. A clearer day ahead. Maybe you can stretch your wings once the wind dies." Eryx's head rose, eyes narrowing, as if pondering that suggestion. "Easy," Jon murmured. "We'll see how strong you feel." He had tried once or twice to watch the dragon attempt flight. The first time had been a clumsy fiasco, with Eryx's beating those tattered wings in the open courtyard and managing little more than a short bound that ended in a painful stumble. The second attempt had lifted the dragon a few feet into the air, only for the damaged membranes to give out, sending Eryx's crashing back to the ground. The frustrated roar that followed still echoed in Jon's memory. Afterward, Eryx seemed resigned to remain earthbound, prowling the yard or dozing in the godwood. Jon glanced around the clearing, noticing footprints that suggested another visitor had come and gone, likely Bran. His younger brother often sat by the heart tree, gazing at Eryx with that distant, inscrutable expression. Sometimes Bran would claim to sense echoes of old magic swirling around the dragon, energy from the runic wards that once contained it. Jon tried to understand what that meant, but the workings of such enchantments felt far beyond his grasp. He only knew that the wards had recognized his mixed blood, Stark and Targaryen, and had responded accordingly, allowing him to break them. The implications weighed on him. Perhaps the old gods had a hand in it, or something older still. But pondering these mysteries made Jon feel even more like an outsider in his own skin. He gave Eryx a final pat and stepped back, allowing the dragon space to rise. The beast groaned, stretching its hind legs. Then, gingerly, it extended its wings. The sound of sinew creaking was audible. For a moment, the wings unfurled halfway, battered membranes fanning the air in a cloud of loose snow. Sunlight caught on the ragged edges, revealing a patchwork of scars that glowed a dull red where the skin was thin. Jon half expected Eryx to try a leap, but the dragon merely held the stance for a moment, then folded the wings again with a huff of breath that churned the snow at its feet. Jon wondered if Eryx felt defeat in that motion. Centuries imprisoned, freed only to discover that flight, the very essence of being a dragon, might remain forever beyond reach. As he watched, a pang of empathy coursed through him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice nearly lost among the rustle of tree branches. A moment later, the gate to the godwood opened, admitting Sansa and two guards. She wore a cloak of dark gray fur, a silver pin shaped like a direwolf's head fastened at the collar. Her mouth was set in a determined line. When her gaze settled on Eryx's, it softened slightly, though her posture remained poised. She lifted a hand in a signal for the guards to remain by the gate, then made her way toward Jon. "Good morning," she greeted him, voice calm in the hush of the trees. He offered a small nod. Morning. You're up early. She glanced at the sky where the sun was a hazy white disk behind thin clouds. Dawn is hardly early around here anymore. Every day brings new tasks, new concerns. Her gaze flickered over the dragon. How is he? About the same. Fed last night. No sign of aggression, still healing. Jon's breath curled in the cold. He tried stretching his wings again, but it didn't look promising. Sansa's eyes traced the ragged edges of Eryx's wings, and her sympathy was clear. At least he's recovering slowly instead of growing worse. The maesters say his vitals are strong and that his body temperature remains high enough to survive northern winters. It's a wonder really how a creature of fire can endure in this climate. Jon shrugged. Dragons adapt, I suppose. She returned her attention to him. Bran's asked to see you later. He has news. I'm not entirely sure what it's about, but he specifically requested your presence in the solar after midday. Jon raised a brow. Something to do with Eryx's? Possibly. He only said it concerned our alliances and the broader realm. Jon felt a familiar flicker of tension in his chest. Bran's visions could be cryptic or they could be painfully direct. Either way, they seldom brought tidings that were easy to address. I'll be there. Sansa offered a faint smile, then turned her attention more fully to the dragon. She walked closer, though not too close, studying Eryx's posture. The dragon didn't stir, merely flicked an eyelid in her direction. She spoke gently as one might address a large, wounded dog. We'll see you fed well tonight, beast. No doubt you'll make short work of another deer or two. She paused, then let out a soft exhale. I never thought I'd see a dragon in Winterfell again. Perhaps the old songs had it right, this realm holds more secrets than any of us can imagine. Jon watched her, thinking how much she had changed since their youth. Sansa Stark, once dreaming of the South's fineries, now reigned as the unspoken queen of the North's day-to-day dealings. The role suited her better than she likely ever would have predicted. She was strong, sharp-eyed, and determined to guard their people from any threat, be it from beyond the wall, from the Iron Throne, or from a dragon in their midst. Yet there she stood, trusting in Jon's judgment regarding this living piece of Targaryen legacy. He couldn't help but feel grateful that she believed in him, even if the entire North still eyed him askance. They lingered another few minutes, discussing the daily feedings, the watch rotations, and the subtle shift in local rumors. Sansa mentioned that some villagers far to the south had begun calling Eryx's the Black Wolf in half-jest, associating him with Stark symbolism since he was under Winterfell's protection. Jon found the notion ironic but not entirely inaccurate. Eryx's had as much to do with the wolves as with the dragons these days, at least symbolically. When they finished, Sansa departed to see to her myriad duties, leaving Jon once more with Eryx's in the quiet hush. He decided to check the wooden barriers set against the heart tree, ensuring they hadn't collapsed under the weight of the recent snowfall. Eryx's watched him with mild curiosity, tail scraping lines in the snow. When Jon finished, he beckoned for Ghost and slipped back through the gate. Later that day, after a quick meal and a consultation with the maesters regarding supply levels, Jon climbed the stairs to the old solar, where Bran often sat. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. The room had an aged feel, with tall shelves of old tomes and a carved wooden table that had been part of Winterfell longer than anyone could remember. Bran waited in his wheeled chair near the fireplace, hands resting on the arms, eyes half-lidded. A single guard stood discreetly in the corner, but at a gesture from Bran, he stepped out to give them privacy. Jon crossed the threshold, feeling a subtle tension in the air. Sansa said, "You wanted to see me." Bran nodded, blinking as though returning from somewhere far away. "Yes, thank you for coming. Sit if you like." Jon found a stool near the table and complied. For a moment, neither spoke. The crackle of flames in the hearth filled the silence. Eventually, Bran spoke. "I've been dreaming again. Or, not dreams, precisely. Visions of the past, glimpses of the future. The Weirwood network is vast, and the presence of Eryx's stirs something in it. He's connected to older magics than any of us realized." Jon frowned. "I know you mentioned that. Do you see how or why?" Bran's gaze drifted to the window. The wards used to confine him were created in part by the children of the forest, and in part by old, secret rites known to the Starks of that era, perhaps a kind of blood magic that drew on both lineages. In that sense, Eryx's is bound to the north. Yet now that you've freed him, the binding is undone or at least changed. The energy flows differently, My visions show me a tapestry unraveling. Jon's chest tightened. Unraveling? That sounds ominous. Bran exhaled slowly. It might be, but it could also be an opportunity. The chains that held Eryx's were tied to certain protective wards around Winterfell. Those wards were never as large or as widely acknowledged as the enchantments at the wall, but they existed, and they contributed to making Winterfell a safe haven, a fortress of warmth even in the heart of winter. Bran paused, turning his gaze back to Jon. I suspect that's why the hot springs beneath the castle have always flowed so strongly, why the crypts remained free of certain influences over the centuries. Now that the wards are broken or altered, I'm not sure if Winterfell's protections will hold as they have. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran through Jon. He recalled how Winterfell's hot springs were legendary, how the walls often retained a subtle warmth even in the coldest winters. It was said that no matter how bitter the season, the castle never froze entirely. Could that have been a result of ancient magic as much as geology? If so, his act of freeing Eryx's might have unintended consequences. Are you saying Winterfell's natural defenses could weaken? Bran nodded. It's possible. Or they may transform into something else. The visions aren't entirely clear, but I believe we should be prepared. This might not affect Winterfell alone. There are echoes that reach farther north, toward the lands once inhabited by the children beyond the wall, and perhaps even as far south as the Neck, where the ground is boggy and the ruins of Moat Cailin still stand. Jon found himself standing abruptly, anxiety coursing through him. We can't let the north become vulnerable. We only just survived the Dead's invasion. If there's some new threat, Bran raised a hand, motioning for calm. We mustn't panic. The Night King was defeated, the White Walkers have been driven back or destroyed. There's no sign of their return. This is different, an unraveling of the tapestry that once bound certain magics to this place. I don't know what shape new threats might take, if any arise at all. But we should be vigilant. The realm has been battered by war and we cannot afford another. Jon paced, his boots echoing on the stone floor. What do you propose? Bran's expression was a mix of serenity and sorrow. We watch, we learn, and we adapt. We have meisters, scribes, and rangers who can gather knowledge about the land's changes. We could send discreet scouts to the far north to see if anything stirs beyond the wall. And perhaps we can glean more from Eryx's himself. The bond you share with him might deepen. He may have knowledge locked in his being, memories of a time long past, though he cannot speak as men do. Jon let out a soft scoff. We're to read a dragon's memories? You overestimate me. Bran's lips curved into a vague smile. Don't underestimate yourself, Jon. You have more power than you realize. That's always been true. Jon sank back onto the stool, running a hand over his face. All right, we'll step carefully. How do we keep this quiet from the other lords who are already on edge about Eryx's? We simply don't alarm them until we have actual cause for alarm, Bran replied. Life continues in the north. Spring will come eventually. If we notice changes, unusual storms, sightings of strange creatures, anything beyond normal winter phenomena, we'll investigate quietly. With luck, nothing emerges. Perhaps freeing Eryx's was more a matter of righting an ancient injustice than inviting a new peril. Jon considered that, a swirl of conflicting emotions in his chest. I hope you're right, he said eventually. I never intended to undo the magic that protected Winterfell, but I couldn't leave him chained like that. Bran nodded gently. No, you did what you felt was right. The future is shaped by choices such as these. A long silence stretched in the solar. Outside, faint voices rose from the courtyard where the daily bustle continued. The crackle of the fireplace offered a measure of warmth that Jon barely felt. He looked at Bran, noticing again how his younger brother's features had become so still, as though he viewed the world through some perpetually distant lens. Sometimes Jon missed the mischievous, spirited boy who once climbed the walls of Winterfell. That boy was gone, replaced by a seer whose calm unsettled everyone around him. In the end, Jon said nothing more. He simply inclined his head in acknowledgement and took his leave, mind reeling with possibilities. He would keep an eye out for these subtle shifts, cracks in the castle walls, changes in the hot springs flow, unusual chills in the crypts. If Winterfell began to lose its ancient warmth, they would adapt, just as they always had. The North endured, and so would the Starks. Over the following days, Jon took steps to implement Bran's suggestions. He and Sansa quietly arranged for a handful of experienced scouts to travel north, beyond the wall, to see if anything was amiss among the wildlings. Tormund Giantsbane was still in those parts, overseeing the Free Folk's attempt to settle the newly thawed regions. Through coded ravens, Jon requested Tormund to watch for strange events, unusual storms, unexplained vanishings, odd lights in the night sky. Tormund's initial reply was blunt: "We always watch. The land's always strange. But we'll keep an extra eye open if it pleases you, Crow." Simultaneously, they dispatched a few trusted men to Moat Cailin and other strategic points in the Neck, instructing them to do the same. Sansa kept the reason vague, citing only that Winterfell wanted to remain apprised of the realm's condition. Meanwhile, the north around them resumed the rhythms of winter survival. Lords from smaller houses visited with petitions about roads blocked by snow or villages lacking supplies. Sansa oversaw these matters, delegating food and allocating labor to keep the roads passable. Jon assisted where he could, his presence lending weight to Winterfell's authority. More caravans arrived bearing trade goods, furs, iron, and occasionally exotic wares from the southern coasts. The name Eryx's was now known throughout the north, though many had yet to see the dragon in person. Some folks said the beast was a sign of the times, a final remnant of the old wars, powerless without its wings. Others insisted that the dragon represented the North's unity with the fire blood of House Targaryen, the same blood that ran in Jon's veins. Rumor spun wild webs of speculation. While Sansa wrestled with politics, Arya found ways to slip in and out of Winterfell, sometimes vanishing for days. She returned with snippets of news from the Riverlands, from the Vale, even from the edges of the Westerlands. Jon never asked how she traveled so freely or avoided detection. He suspected she used her skills learned in faraway lands. Often, she would appear late at night, slipping into the Great Hall or the Godswood to greet Jon or Sansa. Her presence was as quiet as a shadow, but it comforted Jon to know his sister was safe. He noticed that she never seemed particularly surprised by the sight of Eryx's. In truth, it seemed to amuse her more than anything. One evening, he found her crouched by a tree root, studying the sleeping dragon's face with a curious tilt of her head. She only offered Jon a wry smile when she saw him approach, as though to say, "The world has always been full of wonders and horrors. This is just one more." Jon's days settled into a pattern. Rising early to check on Eryx's, conferring with Sansa or the maesters about the realm's needs, receiving updates from guards and outriders, sparring with young knights to keep his sword arm sharp, and returning to the Godswood in the evenings to see the dragon fed. Seldom did any remarkable event occur. Snow fell, people carried on, and Eryx's dozed away the hours. The tension that once crackled around the dragon's existence began to dissipate, replaced by a kind of uneasy acceptance. As long as Eryx's remained docile and contained, the North could abide him. Despite this newfound routine, the quiet never felt permanent. Winter in the North had a way of lulling one into stillness, only for a sudden storm or a crisis to surface without warning. In early evening on a day that had been unremarkable thus far, Jon felt a subtle tremor in the courtyard's mood. He was standing near the great hall doors, listening to a steward's report on grain supplies, when a stable boy came running across the yard. The boy's breath came out in ragged puffs, and he all but collided with Jon before managing to gasp out, "My lord, trouble in the Godswood. The dragon. He's flapping and roaring, like he's in pain or something. Everyone's afraid to get near." Jon handed off the parchment to the startled steward and immediately sprinted toward the Godswood gate, heart pounding. A swirl of anxiety coiled in his gut. He pushed past a pair of onlookers who hovered uncertainly by the gate. Within the Godswood, he heard the unmistakable roar, low and tremulous, like thunder echoing through old bones. He found Eryx's thrashing in the clearing, wings half extended, tail lashing across the snow and flinging clumps of it in every direction. The dragon's head jerked back as if wrestling some unseen foe. A deep, rumbling cry reverberated off the tree trunks. Alarmed guards lingered around the perimeter, crossbows in hand, but no one dared approach. Ghost barked from somewhere nearby, hackles raised. Jon hesitated only a moment before hurrying forward, calling out Eryx's name. Eryx's! He nearly tripped over an exposed root, the jolt sending pain through his knee. Righting himself, he continued until he stood a dozen paces from the frenzied dragon. Eryx's let out another roar, this one ragged, almost anguished, as though something inside was tearing at him. Jon scanned the dragon's body, looking for fresh wounds, but saw none. The same old scars marred the wings, the flank, the chest. No new gash or arrow. Yet the creature shook its head violently, jaws snapping at the air. "Erix's," Jon called again, trying to keep his tone steady. "It's all right. Easy." He took a tentative step closer, ignoring the frantic shouts of guards telling him to stay back. The dragon's tail lashed wildly, smashing into one of the wooden barriers with enough force to splinter it. Jon had to duck as shattered planks flew overhead. Snow swirled, and the heart tree's branches rustled in agitation. At that moment, Bran wheeled into the godswood, guided by a terrified guard who tried to reason with him. But Bran waved the guard off and proceeded, face calm yet urgent. The instant Bran entered the clearing, the dragon's fury seemed to heighten. Erix's roared again, a spurt of faint flame escaping his mouth. The scorching heat made Jon flinch, though it wasn't directed at him. The red light of the flames danced on the trunk of the weirwood before dying in a hiss of steam on the snow. Jon forced himself closer until he could almost touch Erix's flank. The dragon's eye flicked his way, pupils wide with pain. A heavy forelimb struck the ground, sending vibrations through Jon's boots. "Bran!" he shouted, glancing over his shoulder. "What is this?" Bran's eyes were distant, half rolled back in his head, as if he were slipping into a vision. "He's feeling something. A surge of old magic is flooding through him. No, that's not quite right. The wards that once bound him are shifting. There's a resonance from beyond the castle, from the land." Jon couldn't begin to parse that fully, but he knew something external was agitating the dragon. He extended a cautious hand, feeling the reverberation in the air. Erix's swung his head in alarm, nearly knocking Jon off his feet with the brush of a horn. The dragon's scales flared as if heating from within. Another tortured bellow ripped through the godswood, and this time, a gout of flame erupted from his jaws, directed upward. It scorched a circle of branches overhead, sending flaming embers drifting down. Guards scrambled away, shouting warnings about a potential fire. Snow quickly doused the embers before they could spread, but the acrid smell of burnt pine lingered. Jon pressed a hand to the dragon's flank, ignoring the heat that singed the edges of his glove. "Erix's," he said again, voice as steady as he could make it. "Calm." The dragon's side heaved with labored breaths, and the trembling lessened slightly. But the wings still twitched, the tail whipping nervously. A keening sound replaced the roar, a long, low moan that set Jon's teeth on edge. It sounded like despair. Ghost emerged from behind a tree, whining but not daring to come closer. Bran's voice trembled with effort as he reached out with whatever powers he had. It's the land. Something or someone stirs in the far north, an echo that resonates with the old magic that once chained him. He feels the call, but it pains him. He's torn between the freedom you gave him and the leftover threads of that bond. Jon clenched his jaw. He had no idea how to ease a dragon's magical torment. Yet in the same moment he felt a surge of protectiveness. He'd freed Erix's from one prison, only to find the creature still tethered to an ancient force. If there was something in the far north disturbing these energies, it might threaten more than just Erix's. He looked over at Bran, who was shaking, knuckles white where he gripped the chair's arms. "Bran, is there anything we can do? Some right or ward?" Before Bran could respond, Erix's turned his massive head toward Jon. For an instant, the dragon's eye locked on him with such intensity that Jon felt a jolt in his mind. A flicker of an alien presence, raw and fierce. Then, with a heaving effort, Erix's surged away from him, rearing onto hind legs in a show of power that defied his injuries. The wings beat the air once, twice, sending blasts of wind into Jon's face. For a moment, it seemed impossible that the dragon might actually take flight, but then those battered wings caught a fraction of lift. With a mighty roar, Erix's launched himself upward, clearing the ring of trees by a hair's breadth. Branches snapped, raining twigs and snow down. Guards shouted in alarm, ducking beneath the swirling chaos. Jon stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing, as Eryx's rose above the canopy. There was a terrible moment when it seemed the dragon might crash, but somehow, by brute force, Eryx's caught a rising current of air. Fire sparked around his jaws, and a spasm of pain racked his body, but he did not stop. He ascended, beating those scarred wings in defiance of every limitation. A thunderous screech echoed across Winterfell, a cry of both agony and determination. Then Eryx's turned north, trailing a thin swirl of smoke from one wing joint, and vanished into the gray sky. At once, chaos seized the godswood. Guards ran in all directions, some cursing, others calling for crossbows. Bran's eyes flickered back to normal, and he slumped in his chair, gasping. Jon stood rooted to the spot, gazing in stunned disbelief at the place where the dragon had soared beyond the walls. The clouds above churned with unsettled air, but there was no sign of Eryx's shape. He was gone, heading farther north than any living man in Winterfell might track. Sansa burst into the godswood moments later, cloak in disarray. "Jon, the dragon." Her face was flushed with alarm. "I saw it climb over the walls. Is everyone all right?" Jon forced words out through the tightness in his throat. "No one's hurt, I think. Eryx's, it's like something called him north. He just flew." Sansa pressed a hand to her chest, relief and worry mingling. Guards shouted updates that the dragon was out of sight, seeming to vanish over the horizon. Some men in the courtyard had glimpsed it, so huge and dark against the sky. None could believe such a flight was possible with injuries that severe. Yet the evidence was plain. In the hush that followed, Jon turned to Bran. "What did you see?" Bran swallowed hard, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. "Nothing clear, just a pull, a summons. Something in the far north resonates with the old spells that once bound Eryx's. He's gone to confront it or to answer it." His face tightened. "I'm not sure which." Jon clenched his hands into fists, the weight of dread settling on him. He could be flying to his death, or to unleash something we don't understand. Or both, he thought but did not say aloud. Sansa exhaled shakily, glancing at the broken barriers and scorched branches. "We'll gather watchers on the towers. If the dragon returns, we'll know. But if he truly heads deep north..." Her voice trailed off. They all knew that region remained largely uncharted in this generation. Even the free folk had not fully repopulated the far reaches since the war with the dead. It was a place of frozen wastes, howling winds, and ghosts of an older time. Jon found his gaze drawn to Ghost, who had come to press against his leg. The dire wolf whined softly, as if sensing his master's turmoil. Jon stroked Ghost's fur, feeling a numb sense of loss. Eryx's was free in the starkest sense of the word, beyond any control or care they could offer. If the dragon never returned, Jon would always wonder what became of him. And if Eryx's did return, would he be the same creature they had come to know? Bran cleared his throat, his voice subdued. "I'll try to see more through the weirwood network. It may take time, and the far north is not flush with weirwoods. But perhaps I can glean some sense of where Eryx's goes." Jon gave a tense nod. "Do what you can. In the meantime, we need to reassure the people. They'll panic if they think a raging dragon is loose in the skies. That panic might spread across the north and beyond." He glanced at Sansa. "We must prepare our ravens." She agreed, though the worry etched in her brow spoke volumes. "We'll tell them that the dragon left unexpectedly but has no quarrel with any living folk. We'll caution villages to keep watch for a wounded dragon overhead, though I doubt it will appear near farmland." She bit her lip. This is going to stoke a new wave of rumors. Some lords will see it as a threat made real and uncontrolled beast. Jon almost laughed at the irony. They may be right. We don't know what state Eryx's is in or what compels him. We need to be ready in case something follows him south or in case he returns changed. At those words, a grim hush took hold. For a few moments, all Jon could hear was the whisper of snow falling through the godwood canopy. Bran closed his eyes as though already searching for that intangible thread of vision. The guards hovered near the periphery, awaiting orders. Sansa stood with her cloak swirling around her ankles, deep in thought. Jon looked again to the sky, seeing only the swirl of pale gray clouds. The last remnant of the dragon's presence was the faint scent of charred pine and the battered trees that bore the marks of his sudden escape. He let out a breath and gestured for the guards to help clear the broken wood. "We'll do what we must," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "If Eric's soared north, we'll find out why." Even as he spoke, he felt the old stirrings of duty and uncertainty, the same mixture he had felt when deciding to free a chained beast beneath the crypts. He only hoped he had not unleashed a force that would tear the north apart once more. Within the next day, word of Eric's departure spread through Winterfell, then outward by Raven to the local lords. Reactions varied. Some were relieved, good riddance, let him freeze in the wastelands, while others worried that a loose dragon portended new disasters. Still others whispered that the dragon had flown to rejoin a hidden brood beyond the wall, or that Jon Snow had orchestrated the entire thing for some dark Targaryen purpose. The speculation made Jon grit his teeth, but he gave little rebuttal. Facts were scarce. No one truly knew what had triggered Eric's exodus or where the dragon would go. Bran spent long hours in his locked chamber, drifting in and out of trance. Sansa handled the daily affairs of the castle with her usual steadfastness, though her calm demeanor did not disguise the tension that underlay every conversation. Arya was not in Winterfell at the moment. She had left 3 days prior on one of her unexplained journeys, and Jon found himself wishing she were there. At least she provided a certain clarity in times of upheaval. He supposed, however, that she had her own path and no one could force Arya Stark to remain idle for long. In the courtyard, life resumed its usual rhythms. Men practiced with spears, blacksmiths hammered at the forge, and the maesters doled out herbs for coughs and frostbite. But something was missing. A colossal presence that had become part of the background, even if many had feared it. Jon caught people glancing at the Godswood Gate, half expecting to hear a rumble or see a flicker of dragon fire. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the wind. Ghost sensed it too, pacing restlessly at times, sniffing around the clearing where Eric's once slept. Despite the unrelenting winter, Jon felt compelled to stay outdoors, as though waiting for some sign in the skies. On the 3rd day after Eric's departure, he stood on the very rampart where he had once gazed over a snowbound landscape. Now the wind was sharper, carrying ice crystals that stung his cheeks. A pair of guards walked their rounds, saluting as they passed him. He offered a curt nod, lost in his own thoughts. Had Eric's truly found the strength to navigate the harshest stretches of the north? The imagery of that battered dragon pushing itself to fly remained etched in Jon's mind. He could still hear the roar of combined pain and defiance. He half expected to see a dark silhouette on the horizon, returning with tattered wings, perhaps seeking further healing or comfort. But the horizon remained empty. Snow-laden clouds hovered overhead, casting dull shadows over the forests and fields below. The strangled hush of winter pressed in on all sides. As dusk approached, he made his way indoors to the great hall, where supper was being served. The hall was warmed by large hearths, filled with the scent of stewed meats and fresh bread. Conversations rose and fell, some men telling bawdy jokes, others discussing trade routes. Jon took a seat beside Sansa at the high table, offering minimal replies to the courtiers who tried to engage him. He pushed his food around his plate, appetite dulled by worry. Sansa gave him a sidelong glance. "Eat, Jon," she murmured. "Fretting won't bring him back." He managed a small sip of ale. "I'm not fretting, just thinking. Have we heard anything from Bran?" "Not yet," she replied quietly. "He's locked himself away again, searching for glimpses. I told him to rest. He pushes himself too hard." Jon only nodded. They said little else for the remainder of the meal. Afterward, he returned to his chamber, exhausted but knowing sleep would not come easily. He dozed fitfully, dreaming of howling winds and distant roars that may or may not have been real. In those dreams, he sometimes saw Eric's trapped in swirling snow, locked in combat with a figure that bore a face of shifting ice. Other times, he saw the dragon perched on a spire of black stone, gazing down at a frozen sea that stretched endlessly to the horizon. He woke more than once in a cold sweat, unsure which images were his own nightmares and which might be echoes of something that truly lurked in the north. On the fourth day, just after dawn, a steward knocked on Jon's door, face pale. "My lord, Bran Stark requests your presence in the library tower. Urgently." Jon quickly dressed in warm clothes and made his way through the corridors. His breath quickened with every step, anxious to learn what Bran had discovered. The library tower was a maze of shelves, scrolls, and dusty corners. Bran awaited him near a window overlooking the training yard, a small table set with a single candle. The daylight outside was weak, filtering through frosted glass. Bran's posture sagged. Dark circles lay under his eyes, and his hands shook slightly against the chair's arms. Jon crossed the space, heedless of the dust swirling in his wake. "Bran," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What have you seen?" Bran swallowed hard. Pieces of a path through the wilderness, an old watchtower lost to time, battered by the wind. I saw Eric's circling overhead. He was in pain, but he continued onward. Bran's gaze was haunted. He travels beyond the Frostfangs, into a region where the children of the forest once held sway. I saw glimpses of swirling lights in the sky, an aurora dancing in green and purple. Under that aurora lies an ancient place, older than men's records. It resonates with the same magic that once bound Eric's. Jon's pulse thundered. What does that mean? Is he searching for something? Bran's lips parted, and he exhaled in a near whisper. He's drawn there, compelled, as if finishing a cycle that began when the wards were placed on him. Something calls him to that place, and I fear that if he reaches it, he may not return. Whether it consumes him or changes him, I can't yet tell. My visions are murky, but I sense a great gathering of power, a confluence of leftover magic from the Dawn Age. Jon's mind raced. He tried to recall old tales of the far north, where some said the White Walkers had first arisen, where the land of always winter gave way to endless ice. Is it dangerous to all of us, or just to him? Bran closed his eyes briefly. I'm not certain. The wards that contained him were a chain linking him to the Starks. If he merges with whatever this place holds, that link might reforge or shatter entirely. Either outcome could have ramifications. If a new bond is formed, who knows what shape it might take? He forced his eyes open, meeting Jon's. We see. And ignore this. Eric's carries more than just flame. He carries centuries of woven spells from men and children of the forest alike. If that power is set loose in the wrong way, it could stir sleeping things. Jon's throat felt tight. He remembered the terror of the undead army, the knowledge that certain malevolent forces once walked the earth. He had no desire to see any new threat awaken. Then we should go after him, he said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could reconsider. If we sit idle, we risk letting something horrifying unfold. If there's a chance we can guide Eric's away from that place, or at least learn the truth, we owe it to the north to try. Bran looked at him intently. It's a journey not many would survive. And even if you found him, there's no guarantee he'd welcome your presence or that you could change his course. Jon braced himself against the back of a chair, staring at the candle on the table. The flame flickered in an errant draft. Perhaps. But I freed him. If he's in danger, or if he's about to unleash a danger on the world, I have to do something. Bran nodded after a moment of contemplation. Then you'll need a small party experienced in traveling the far north. Supplies, knowledge of the routes. Tormund might help. Jon felt a surge of relief that Bran didn't try to talk him out of it. Yes, we'll gather what we need. I'll speak with Sansa. She won't be thrilled, but I can't think of any alternative. Someone must find out what's really happening out there. Bran's lips twitched in the faintest smile. It's fitting in a way that you'd venture beyond the wall again. The watchers on the walls never truly stop watching, do they? Jon recalled the old vows he'd spoken half a lifetime ago. My watch has ended, or so he believed. But the North held its own brand of duty. In some ways, it never ended for him. No, he said softly, they don't. He left Bran in the library tower and descended to find Sansa, heart pounding with a new sense of urgency. By midday, he had convened with her and explained the gist of Bran's visions. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more guarded with each passing moment. At last, she put her hands on the desk and said, You realize this is dangerous beyond measure. The far north is a death trap in winter. You have no guarantee you'll even find the dragon, let alone bring him back. Jon nodded, exhaling. I know, but we have no choice. If we do nothing, we risk letting some unknown power take hold. And he's not just a random beast. You've said it yourself, we took responsibility for him. I can't ignore that. Sansa's composure cracked for an instant, a flicker of worry shining in her eyes. You always did pick the hardest paths, Jon. She swallowed. How many will you take? Jon thought of Tormund, of the free folk who knew the land. Maybe a handful of seasoned fighters, men or women who'd braved the wrath of winter. A small group, no more than 6 or 7. We'll travel light, on horseback or perhaps with the free folks' guidance. The main challenge is crossing the wall. We'll use the restored passages near Castle Black. She let out a shaky breath. Then you'll need supplies from the stockrooms, specialized gear, furs, dragonglass weapons, just in case. Her voice wavered slightly. I'll help arrange it, but I'll also do my best to keep the realm calm in your absence. If news spreads that you've gone after a missing dragon, half the North might think you've lost your mind. Jon allowed himself a small, grim smile. Maybe I have, but it doesn't change what must be done. They embraced briefly, the closeness of siblings who had braved so many hardships. Sansa's voice was quiet against his ear. Come back, Jon. The North needs you. He squeezed her arms in reply, unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Then, with a nod, he stepped away. There was much to do and little time to do it. That evening, he found himself in the yard, quietly assembling a short list of volunteers. 2 were men who had served at the wall with him, tough rangers familiar with beyond-the-wall conditions. Another was a huntress from House Mormont, known for her skill in tracking and archery. They each expressed a mixture of wariness and loyalty, but they agreed to follow Jon, for he had earned their respect through the wars past. He hoped Tormund would join them, or at least send some free folk to guide them further north. They would have to rely on the old friendship formed amid the chaos of the White Walkers. As they loaded supplies onto a pair of sturdy mules, food rations, fire-starting kits, extra furs, Jon felt an undercurrent of déjà vu. How many times had he prepared for a harsh journey, uncertain if he would return? Memories of hard home, of the long night, of battles on the ice made him clench his jaw. Still, he pressed on. This was the path he had chosen. By dawn, the group was ready. Sansa met them by the gate, flanked by guards and a few curious onlookers. The wind nipped at her cheeks, turning them pink. The horses are waiting, she said, voice subdued but steady. Everything's packed. Do you have the maps? Jon tapped the leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Yes, though the far north is only vaguely charted. Once we get beyond the wall, I'll be relying on Tormund's knowledge. She nodded. I've sent ravens ahead to Castle Black, telling them of your arrival. You shouldn't have too many delays. Her gaze flicked over the small party. 2 rangers who had survived the wars, the Mormont huntress, another man from the Winterfell guard, plus Jon himself. They all wore thick cloaks, layered furs, and carried as little metal armor as possible. Speed and warmth were the priorities. Ghost stood beside Jon's horse, the direwolf's breath misting in the cold. Sansa reached out, squeezing Jon's gloved hand. Be safe, she whispered, eyes bright with concern. Erix's was under our protection. He still is, in a way. But more than that, you're my brother. I don't want to lose you again. He offered a gentle smile, tucking a stray strand of her hair behind her ear as he had done in childhood. I'll do everything in my power to return. I promise. She nodded, stepping back. The group mounted their horses, the animals stamping at the snow. The gates of Winterfell creaked open, revealing the snowy stretch of road beyond. Jon glanced up at the ramparts, half expecting to see Bran or Arya. But only a few guards stood there, scanning the white plains. He leaned forward in the saddle, feeling the old stir of adrenaline. With a final nod to Sansa, he spurred his horse forward. His companions followed suit, hooves crunching into the frosty ground. Ghost loped alongside them, a silent sentinel. The wind carried flurries of snow across their path, swirling around the riders. As Winterfell receded behind them, Jon cast one more backward glance at the castle's walls and towers, at the banners flapping overhead. The hush of farewell lingered, and then he turned away, facing north. They rode throughout the morning, crossing through quiet villages that hunkered down against the cold. Sometimes curious onlookers emerged from cottages to watch the small band pass, their faces etched with the hardships of winter. Jon and his party said little. The mission was too urgent, too uncertain for idle conversation. Gray clouds drifted overhead, threatening more snowfall. The wind was steady, biting at their exposed skin. They pressed on. By midday, the road narrowed, twisting through a forest thick with evergreens. Snow-laden branches rustled overhead, occasionally dumping small cascades of powder onto the horses. Jon's mind drifted to Eric's, imagining the dragon's battered wings cutting through these same skies. He wondered if the creature had soared above the treetops or if it had chosen a more direct route along the foothills. Perhaps it had flown too high for any man to track. The thought unsettled him. If a beast of such size could vanish into the wintry gloom, how could a handful of riders hope to find it? Yet he clung to the knowledge that Eric's had a connection to him, or at least to the Targaryen side of him. Perhaps that would guide them somehow. Ahead, the trees parted, revealing a ridge that overlooked a shallow valley. The party paused to let the horses rest for a few minutes, and Jon surveyed the land. Over the ridge, they would descend into a wide swath of countryside before angling northwest toward Castle Black. They expected to reach the old stronghold in about 3 days, provided the weather held. He motioned for the group to continue. The rangers took the lead, scanning for any sign of bandits or wolves. The Mormont huntress rode near Jon, who'd pulled low, an arrow knocked loosely in her bow, ready in case of sudden threats. The wind whistled through the pines, carrying the distant caw of crows. Ghost trotted ahead, nose to the ground. Sometime in the afternoon, a light snow began to fall, softly at first, then more heavily, obscuring their vision. They pressed on in silence, forging a path through the drifts. That night, they made camp near a half-frozen creek. The trees offered some shelter from the wind, and they dug a crude fire pit to protect the flames from the gusts. The horses snorted, grateful for the respite. Over bowls of stewed jerky and dried vegetables, Jon conferred with the rangers about the route. They had once patrolled these territories, though never in such harsh conditions. Still, the path to Castle Black was straightforward enough for those who knew it. After the meal, Jon sat by the fire, Ghost curled beside him. Sparks danced into the night sky. The others drifted off to bedrolls or kept watch on the perimeter. Jon stared into the flickering flames, recalling how, in the earliest legends, Targaryens had used dragonfire to conquer. Yet here he was, a man of both Stark and Targaryen blood, trekking north on a mission to preserve some ancient equilibrium. He wondered if his ancestors could ever have imagined such a scenario. He thought of the fear in Eric's eyes, the flash of something akin to a plea for help. Was that memory real, or was he projecting his own guilt? Eventually, exhaustion overcame him. He slept fitfully, dreaming once more of swirling snows and ghostly shapes in the dark. Once or twice, he woke with a start, hand on the hilt of Longclaw. But there was no danger, only the hush of the winter night and the faint crackle of dying embers. 2 more days of hard riding brought them to Castle Black's vicinity. The black granite of the wall loomed in the distance, though it was no longer the impenetrable barrier it once was. Large portions still stood, but the breach from the wars against the Night King and the subsequent attempts to rebuild gave the structure a patchwork appearance. Watchtowers dotted the top, torches glimmering against the gloom. Jon felt a pang of nostalgia. This place had been his home once, where he'd taken his vows. The memories of brotherhood, sacrifice, and heartbreak stirred in him. They approached the gate, where a small garrison of Night's Watch men and some free folk on guard duty waved them closer. The black and white attire of the Night's Watch looked as worn as ever. Their leader, a grizzled man named Edison, not to be confused with Dolorous Ed, who had died in the war, stepped forward. "Jon Snow," he said, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Haven't seen you in a while. We got your raven." Didn't say much, though. Jon dismounted, hands stiff from the cold. "I'll explain what I can. We need to go beyond the wall. Is Tormund here?" Edison nodded. "He's inside, cursing the cold and drinking our ale. Came down a few days back. Something about a worrying sign in the far north. Not that the far north has ever lacked worrying signs." He eyed Jon's companions. "You're welcome to stable your horses and warm yourselves. We're short-staffed, mind, but we'll do what we can." Jon offered a grateful nod. "Thank you. We won't linger long." They led the horses into the courtyard, which looked much as Jon remembered, piled with snow, the old wooden staircases leading up to the top of the wall. Ghost bounded around, sniffing for familiar scents. Rookeries perched on wooden rafters, black wings shuffling. Within the common hall, a few men hunched over stews or tried to mend gear. Eyes followed Jon and his group, curious and cautious. He couldn't help but recall the day he'd first arrived, a bastard boy uncertain of his future. Now he returned as a man carrying a Targaryen Stark legacy, leading a small expedition to chase a missing dragon. They found Tormund near a hearth, draining a cup of ale and roaring with laughter at some poor recruit's attempt to tell a joke. When he caught sight of Jon, his face split into a wide grin. "Jon Snow," he boomed, standing. "I heard you were coming, but I didn't believe it. Thought maybe a crow had lost its wits." He clapped Jon on the shoulder, nearly knocking him off balance. "Been too long, friend." Jon mustered a half-smile. "It has, Tormund. Good to see you. Though I wish it were under better circumstances." Tormund eyed him. "Aye, you always have some dire reason for heading into the cold. Come sit. Warm yourself. Then tell me what in the seven hells drags you beyond the wall in the middle of winter when you're not even wearing black anymore." Jon's companions set aside their packs and found seats at a nearby table. Ghost settled by the fire, content to let its warmth soothe his paws. Jon took a moment to remove his gloves, flexing his stiff fingers. He looked Tormund in the eye, reading the lines of worry behind the man's boisterous facade. "We're searching for a dragon," he said quietly. "A wounded dragon that flew north." Tormund's brow furrowed. "A dragon? Thought they were all dead or gone. Dany's beasts, if you recall." He scratched his beard. "Or is this another one you lot grew out of an egg somewhere?" "It's complicated," Jon said. "I found him chained beneath Winterfell. Freed him. He was healing, living in the Godwood until a few days ago. Something called him north, some old magic. He took flight, though we never thought him capable of such a journey with his injuries. Bran had visions of him heading beyond the Frostfangs, perhaps deeper. I need to follow." Tormund let out a soft whistle. "A chained dragon, only you, Jon Snow." He gulped another mouthful of ale, then wiped his mouth. "All right? You're going north of the Frostfangs. The free folk avoid that region this time of year. Too cold, too many ice crags. Not much game. But if a big flying beast is about, maybe it'll scare the local wildlife. We've seen some odd signs ourselves. Came here to ask the crows if they'd seen anything." Jon's heart quickened. "What signs?" Tormund's expression grew serious. "A storm that doesn't move like normal storms. Swirling in place above a stretch of hills near an old ruin. Lights in the sky that shimmer even during the day. And we found a cave with old carvings. Looked like those of the children, but older. My people have steered clear. We lost a couple of hunters who went poking around." Jon glanced at his companions. "That lines up with what Bran described. He saw some place with swirling lights, powerful magic." He turned back to Tormund. "Will you guide us there? Or send some of your best trackers with us?" Tormund snorted. "Thought you'd never ask. I came here to see if the crows had men to spare. Seems you're all we've got. So yes, I'll take you. Been too long since I had a proper adventure with you, Crow." Jon felt genuine relief. Tormund was one of the few men alive who truly understood the far north and had faced the supernatural forces that once plagued it. "Thank you," he said simply. "We'll leave as soon as possible. Time isn't on our side." Tormund rose and bellowed for more ale. "We'll need to gather a few of my lads. Big Wall, Torrik, maybe that quiet one with the scar. He's good in a scrap." He grinned broadly at Jon, though worry still edged his eyes. "Just like old times, eh?" Jon forced a small smile. "Let's hope not exactly like old times." Tormund laughed, but it was a softer sound, tinged with unease. They both remembered the terrors of Hardhome, the Whites, the White Walkers, the unstoppable tide of death. While those days seemed behind them, the far north still held secrets that did not rest easily. That night, they planned the route, studying rough maps on the table. The group would pass through the Giant's Stair, skirt the edge of the Frostfangs, and head west-northwest where Tormund's scouts had seen the storms. If the weather held, they might reach the suspect region in a week. A week of travel over frozen rivers and ridges where the wind could flay a man's flesh in minutes if he was unprepared. Jon tried to sleep in his old quarters at Castle Black, but the memories pressed in. He recalled restless nights long ago, hearing the wind whistle through the cracks in the wall, worrying about the next threat from beyond. Some things, he realized, never truly left him. The watch might end for some men, but for him it felt endless. In the morning, they set out through the battered gate at the wall's base, the chill biting deeper than before. Tormund led 3 of his free folk hunters, riding shaggy garrons that handled the snow better than southern steeds. Jon and his companions trailed, with Ghost loping beside them. The land beyond the wall stretched in silent, wind-swept plains for miles, broken by the occasional cluster of stunted pine or rocky outcrop. Drifts sometimes reached the horses' chests, forcing them to pick their way carefully. The air was so cold it seemed to burn. They pressed on for days, stopping only to eat, rest, and warm themselves by quick fires. The region grew more desolate. Dead trees jutted like skeletal fingers from ice-laden ground. At times, they traveled under eerie twilight when the sun dipped below the horizon yet left a faint glow in the sky. Snow flurries became common, swirling in gusts that stung the eyes. Yet no sign of Erix's appeared in the skies. On the 5th day past the wall, they emerged onto a plateau that overlooked a wide valley. Tormund called a halt, pointing to the far horizon. There, he said, voice muffled by the fur around his face. See that swirl of clouds? It's not moving east or west, just spinning in place. We've watched it for days now. Jon squinted, following his gaze. Indeed, a bank of dark clouds hung beyond a series of ridges, seeming to rotate slowly as though anchored to a particular spot. The sight made the hair on Jon's arms prickle. That's where we're heading? Tormund nodded. Aye. Not far from the place we found those old carvings too. Could be that's where your dragon is drawn. Jon felt a surge of foreboding. He remembered Bran's description of swirling lights and a confluence of power. Perhaps the clouds hid that eerie aurora. Then let's keep moving. We'll make camp at the base of those ridges. They descended the plateau's slope, horses plodding carefully. Time blurred as the group navigated icy terrain, Tormund pointing out hazards, thin ice over hidden streams, sudden drops into ravines. The wind battered them, moaning through rock formations. Late in the day, they reached a natural hollow where a few gnarled pines grew. Tormund deemed it suitable for a camp. They tethered the horses in what little shelter the pines offered and set about gathering firewood. The free folk hunters scraped snow aside to expose ground where they could build a ring of stones for the fire. Jon helped, feeling the ache in his limbs from days of travel. Once the fire was lit and the horses tended to, Rumund passed around dried meat and skins of ale. The warmth of the flames was minimal in the biting wind, but it made a difference. Jon rubbed his hands together, then glanced at the swirling clouds in the distance. They seemed closer now, an ominous mass on the horizon. Ghost lay near the fire, ears twitching, eyes glowing faintly in the flicker of light. The Mormont huntress, a woman named Hela, grunted in displeasure. Bad omens, that sky. Reminds me of the long night, though not as dark. A free folk man with a scar across his cheek spat. Bad omens are good, we'll see it through. We survived the dead, didn't we? A murmur of agreement rose, though none seemed eager to voice their deeper fears. Jon stared into the distance, recalling the watchwords that had once guided him. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. He wondered if some part of that vow had bound him forever. Perhaps it had. He breathed in, tasting the tang of ice on the air. In the northern sky, faint flickers of greenish light danced behind the low clouds and aurora, just as Bran had foreseen. Erix's was out there somewhere. Jon silently prayed the dragon had not perished in the storms. Morning brought a relentless wind that howled across the ridges. They broke camp and rode closer to the swirling storm, eventually reaching a rocky outcrop overlooking a broad valley. There, the wind died down abruptly, as if they'd passed into a lee formed by the ridges. Snow fell gently, but visibility was decent. Tormund beckoned for them to dismount, pointing ahead. We'll go on foot from here. Too many crevices in the valley. The horses could break a leg. We'll tether them among those boulders. Jon surveyed the valley. The ground was uneven, strewn with icy rocks and patches of old snowdrifts. Far across, the swirling clouds hovered low, lit from within by pale light. It felt unnatural, as though the sky were pinned to the earth by an invisible force. All right, he said quietly. We proceed on foot. Keep weapons ready. They secured the horses and advanced. Ghost scouted ahead, nose to the ground, while the free folk parted into a loose formation, scanning the terrain. The snow was knee-deep in places, forcing them to wade or clamber over rocks. Occasional gusts of wind whipped snow into their faces. Time moved strangely, as though the landscape lulled them into a monotonous trance of trudging, exhaling, and trudging again. But the swirling clouds beckoned, growing more distinct with each step. Eventually, they crested a small ridge overlooking a depression in the valley. Tormund held up a hand for them to halt. The scene below took Jon's breath away. A ring of standing stones, ancient, weathered, partially encased in ice, encircled a large, sunken area. In the center stood a black spire, rising like a spear from the ground. The swirling clouds formed a vortex directly above that spire, and faint flickers of greenish aurora rippled through them. One of the free folk inhaled sharply. Never seen the likes of that before. John's heart hammered. Bran's visions had spoken of old magic, of a place tied to the children of the forest. This was clearly no simple ruin. The standing stones bore markings. Even from this distance, he saw odd symbols carved into them. The black spire looked like obsidian or some other dark stone. Snow blanketed much of it, but occasionally, the swirling wind uncovered glimpses of a glossy surface that reflected the pale light. The entire area pulsed with an eerie silence, like the hush before a thunderclap. Hela nocked an arrow, eyes scanning for movement. "I see no sign of your dragon," she muttered. John studied the ring. Could Eryx's have arrived and then moved on? Or was he? The thought ended abruptly as a faint roar echoed across the valley, barely audible over the wind. John's eyes snapped to the spire. There, partially hidden behind the ring of stones, he caught a glimpse of movement. A dark shape, too large to be any ordinary animal. Another roar came, this time full of pain and fury. "That's him," John breathed. Eryx's was here, though the tension coiling in his gut told him it wasn't a simple reunion. "Let's go," he said, voice firm. Carefully, they descended the ridge, slipping in the snow, hearts pounding. The sense of palpable energy increased with every step, as though the air crackled. By the time they reached the outer perimeter of the standing stones, John's skin tingled. The symbols on the stones glowed faintly, etched with a shimmering hue that reminded him of runes he'd seen on the chains that once bound Eryx's. Wind whipped around them, carrying swirling flakes in spirals. The ring was arranged in a perfect circle, a hidden gateway to the black spire beyond. They passed between two monoliths, stepping into the circle. Instantly, the wind died, replaced by a stillness that prickled John's ears. A faint hum pervaded the air, resonating in his bones. The swirling clouds overhead seemed closer, as if pressing down. Ghost padded beside him, a low growl building in the direwolf's throat. At last they saw Eryx's. The dragon lay near the base of the black spire, wings spread across the snow, chest heaving. The once battered membranes were covered in frost, and his sides bore fresh scratches as if he'd scraped along the rocky ground. He was trying to rise but failing, letting out ragged moans that reverberated within the circle of stones. The black spire loomed behind him, about twice the dragon's height. Strange grooves ran along its surface, shimmering with the same unnatural glow as the runes on the stones. John rushed forward, ignoring Tormund's warning hiss. He approached cautiously, calling the dragon's name. Eryx's turned his head, eyes blazing with a red glow. A snarl escaped the beast's jaws, flame flickering at the edges. John saw the pain etched in every scale, the trembling of limbs half frozen by the journey. Yet behind that suffering was a terrible compulsion, as though the dragon struggled to obey something calling from the spire. "Easy," John murmured, raising his hands. He could see the raw, bloody patches on Eryx's chest, likely from crashing into the ice or the ring of stones. Something in the spire's presence was pushing him, and he lacked the strength to resist. "It's me, John." His companions fanned out in a semicircle, weapons at the ready but not aimed. No one wanted to provoke a wounded dragon. Eryx's shifted, letting out a roar that shook snow from the spire. The runic glow intensified, and John felt a stab of pain in his own head, as if something pressed at his mind. He gasped, staggering. A flicker of images flashed behind his eyes, ancient rituals performed by figures with carved faces, a swirling vortex of green light, a direwolf sigil, a dragon wreathed in chains. He blinked, disoriented. This place was a nexus of memory and magic, and it hammered at anyone with Stark or Targaryen blood, or perhaps both. "John," Tormund shouted, stepping closer. "You all right?" John gritted his teeth. "I'll manage." He forced himself toward the dragon, leaning on Longclaw as he trudged through snow. The black spire pulsed with an eerie luminescence, as if beckoning them all into a dark heart. Eryx's eyes darted between the spire and John, a war raging behind those reptilian pupils. The dragon's jaws parted, revealing a swirl of flame. For an instant, John expected to be incinerated, but the flame never erupted. Instead, Eryx's groaned, wings flailing weakly, as though something within the spire's power pinned him in place. John braved the final steps until he stood just beyond the dragon's forelimb. Heat radiated from the scales, fighting the bitter cold. Slowly, he placed a hand on the largest scale he could reach, feeling Erix's trembling. "You flew so far," Jon murmured, voice rough. "Why? What is this place doing to you?" Erix's let out a sound almost like a whine, smoke curling from his nostrils. His tail lashed the snow, carving deep gouges. Behind Jon, the others moved cautiously around the perimeter, checking for threats. Ghost circled to the other side of the dragon, ears flat. Tormund cursed under his breath at the swirling lights overhead. Then it happened, the spire's glow intensified and a line of runes along its length flared like molten gold. A resonant hum pulsed through the circle of standing stones. Erix's roared, rearing his head back. Jon felt a wave of force slam into him, nearly knocking him off his feet. An invisible current of magic battered his mind, flooding it with images he could barely process. He saw glimpses of a time when men and the children of the forest performed a binding ritual, capturing a young dragon with runes carved in stone and blood. He saw fleeting impressions of a pact to keep that dragon imprisoned, to harness its power as a ward for the land. The images churned, merging with the memory of his own act of freeing Erix's. Something in the circle recognized him as the key that had broken the chain. He tasted copper on his tongue, realized he'd bitten his lip. Erix's thrashed again, spitting a jet of flame that arced into the air. Snow hissed into steam. The spire pulsed, and cracks appeared in its surface. Jon's heart lurched. If that spire were some kind of anchor for the old magic, what happened if it broke? Tormund shouted a warning. "Jon, get back. Something's not right." But Jon remained where he was, trying to stabilize Erix's, pressing a hand to the dragon's scales. Erix's as I turned toward him, wild and frantic. In that moment, Jon sensed the creature's fear. This was not an act of will but rather the final step in a forced journey, an echo of an ancient spell demanding the dragon's return to be consumed or transformed. Jon felt a surge of defiance. He had not freed Erix's just to let the creature die in another form of bondage. He drew in a ragged breath and shouted, "No." The word rang across the circle, echoing off the stones. He pressed harder against Erix's flank as though willing the dragon to resist. "You're free. Do you hear me? You owe them nothing. Fight this." A fresh wave of force hit him, staggering him backward. The spire groaned, fractures spreading across its obsidian-like surface. The swirling storm above roiled faster, flashing with green light. It was as if the circle's ancient magic had awakened fully, reacting to the presence of its long-lost prisoner and the man who had undone the wards. The runes on the standing stones blazed. Ghost howled. The entire valley seemed poised on the brink of cataclysm. Jon gripped Longclaw. He felt that intangible bond between him and the dragon, forged by his Targaryen blood and tempered by the nights spent in Winterfell's Godwood. Erix's, for all his ferocity, had recognized Jon. Now, in this place of primal power, Jon intended to break the chain once and for all. He sheathed Longclaw and pressed both hands to Erix's heaving side, ignoring the blast of heat. Closing his eyes, he poured every ounce of will he had into a single impulse. "You are free. You are not theirs to use." Images flooded him again. This time, they included recollections of Daenerys's dragons, of Rhaegal allowing Jon to mount him, of the intense rush he'd felt in the presence of living flame. He merged that with the memory of Ned Stark's quiet honor, the starkness of Winterfell's snows, the unwavering loyalty of a dire wolf. He gave it all to Erix's, offering the dragon an alternative to the doom that ancient runes demanded. A deafening crack resounded. Jon opened his eyes in time to see a fault line race up the spire's surface. With a final groan, the spire shattered, exploding outward in shards of black stone. A blast of energy rippled through the circle, throwing Jon and the others to the ground. Sharp fragments hissed through the air. Jon felt one slice past his shoulder, a flash of pain. He landed in the snow, ears ringing. Erix's let out a roar that shook the valley. Freed of the spire's hold, the dragon reared up, stretching battered wings in defiance. A torrent of flame burst from his jaws, washing over the remains of the black stone shards. The standing stones flickered, their runes sputtering, then went dark. Silence fell, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind returning to the circle. Jon groaned and pushed himself upright, every muscle aching. Smoke billowed where the spire had stood, scattered fragments glowing red from residual heat. The swirling clouds overhead began to unwind, the vortex dissipating as if a tension had been released. The valley's hush resumed, the unnatural storm receding. He saw Tormund and the others rising, battered but alive. Ghost shook off snow, whining in concern as he trotted toward Jon. Then Jon realized Erix's was moving. The dragon stumbled a few steps away from the spire's ruin, wings half furled, leaving deep gouges in the snow. Jon scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and approached again. Erix's? His voice emerged as a hoarse rasp. The dragon slumped to the ground, chest heaving. Smoke still drifted from the corners of his mouth. Jon could see the raw burns on the beast's chest and limbs, the frost that clung stubbornly to the wing membranes. Cautiously, he laid a hand on Erix's flank. The dragon's breathing was labored, but the frantic thrashing had ceased. The runic chain was broken. Whatever final hold the circle had tried to reassert was gone. Jon sensed it, a deep stillness in the air, as though the land itself exhaled after centuries of tension. "You did it," he murmured, unsure whether he spoke to himself or Erix's. "You're truly free." Erix's eyes closed, a rumble vibrating through his body. Jon felt an odd swell of relief and sorrow. So much pain had marked the dragon's life. Now, perhaps there was a chance at peace, though survival was not guaranteed out here in the frozen wastes. Tormund limped over, a shallow gash along his brow. "You're a madman, Jon Snow." That was some show of fire. Jon managed a weary smile. "Are you all right?" "Good enough." Tormund glanced at Erix's. "So that was the cause of these storms? A big magical rock hooking the dragon's soul?" "Something like that." Jon sighed. "We need to tend his wounds if we can. Then we have to decide how to get him south, or if that's even possible." He motioned for the others to gather. They formed a small circle around the exhausted dragon, uncertain how to proceed. The swirling clouds overhead had thinned, revealing a cold, clear sky. A faint glimmer of aurora still danced at the horizon, but it felt more natural, no longer anchored to dark magic. They inspected Erix's injuries. The repeated flights and collisions had left deep gouges in the dragon's scales, some bleeding sluggishly. Frostbite nipped at the edges of the wings where the membrane was thinnest. The maesters had taught Jon a few basic remedies, but treating a massive dragon in the middle of a frozen valley was a far cry from tending a horse. Still, they did what they could, washing away the blood with melted snow and applying salves from their limited supplies. Erix's bore it with quiet, pained rumbling, occasionally snapping his jaws if they pressed too hard. When they finished, night was fully upon them. The temperature plummeted. Tormund and the others built a large fire near one of the standing stones, grateful that the runes had gone dark and apparently harmless. They set up bedrolls and a makeshift windbreak. Erix's lay near the spire's shattered remains, occasionally releasing a soft groan. Jon stayed close by, stroking the dragon's neck, murmuring words of reassurance. Ghost prowled the perimeter, tail twitching in agitation. Hela called softly. "We can't stay here forever. The horses are miles back and this valley isn't safe." Jon nodded. "I know, but we can't move him. Not tonight." He glanced at Erix's, whose eyes opened a sliver, revealing that old red glow. "Maybe tomorrow, if he regains some strength, we can coax him to walk or fly a short distance. We need shelter, a proper place to rest." Tormund scratched his beard. "There's a cave system not too far east. We found it scouting last year. Might serve as a temporary hide for the beast." Jon considered it. "If we can get him that far, yes. Then perhaps we can figure out how to get him back to Winterfell or somewhere else safe." Tormund frowned, scanning the shattered spire. "You sure the old magic is gone? Don't want any more surprises." Jon looked at the circle of standing stones. The runes were dim, the hum of power replaced by normal winter silence. "I think so. The spire anchored it, and that's destroyed." He couldn't quite articulate the sense of finality he felt. It was as though some ancient pact had been forcibly broken, freeing Erix's in a manner more complete than mere physical liberation. The cost had been high, but the dragon still breathed. That night, they kept watch and shifts. Jon hardly slept, staying by Erix's side, ensuring the dragon's breathing remained steady. On one such watch, he stared at the dark sky, stars shimmering. Above the ring of stones, the aurora flickered faintly, no longer menacing but strangely beautiful. He found his thoughts drifting to Winterfell, wondering if Bran sensed what had happened, if Sansa worried for his safety. The journey had nearly cost them their lives, and yet here he was, breathing, and so was the dragon. It felt like a victory carved from the ice of despair. Toward dawn, he heard Erix's stir. The dragon lifted his head, blinking slowly. Jon rose from where he dozed against a standing stone. "Erix's?" he whispered, stepping carefully over the snow. The dragon released a tired rumble, exhaling a brief plume of smoke. Jon placed a hand on the scaled neck. The flesh felt warmer than before, less of that terrifying cold. Erix's gaze shifted to Jon, no longer wild but somber. Jon felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. He had undone the final shackle that bound the dragon to this cruel fate. Erix's was free to survive or die on his own terms, no longer manipulated by the runes of men and children. And for reasons Jon might never fully comprehend, the dragon accepted him as an ally in that freedom. The morning light emerged over the ridges, pale gold on untouched drifts of snow. Tormund and the others rose, stiff and cold, ready to face another day in the far north. "We move east," Tormund announced, glancing at Eryx's. "If the beast can walk, we'll lead him to the caves. If he can't, we'll figure something else out, but we can't stay here." Jon agreed, and they gathered their gear, stamping the cold out of their limbs. Carefully, they encouraged the dragon to stand, coaxing him with gestures and gentle shoves. Eryx's hissed in protest at first, but eventually shifted, planting his claws in the snow. It took great effort for him to rise, battered wings trembling from the strain. But he managed it, each breath a labored gust of steam. They began a slow, careful trek out of the valley, Tormund leading the way, a free folk hunter scouting ahead for stable ground. The ring of standing stones receded behind them, the broken spire lying in smoking fragments. Jon walked near Eryx's flank, one hand resting on the scales, as if to lend support. The others fanned out, watchful. The path was treacherous in places, but the group moved with dogged determination, pushing aside the weight of fear and exhaustion. It was near midday by the time they rounded the eastern ridge and saw a cluster of jagged rocks that marked the entrance to a cave. The land sloped downward into a depression that offered some shelter from the wind. Tormund called a halt. "There. If my memory holds, there's a cavern big enough to fit a mammoth, or maybe bigger." Jon eyed the entrance. It looked narrow at first glance. But if Tormund believed it opened up inside, it was worth trying. "We'll guide Eryx's in slowly," he said. "Let's just hope he cooperates." The dragon, whether by exhaustion or by some deeper understanding, allowed them to direct him toward the mouth of the cave. The opening was indeed just wide enough for the dragon's shoulders. Eryx's let out a low snort, steam gusting from his nostrils, but he angled his body sideways, scraping the rocky sides. Snow tumbled off his back in clumps. With a final heave, the beast entered. Inside, the cavern widened significantly, revealing a vaulted space that smelled of damp stone. Ice hung from stalactites, shimmering in the half-light. Tormund's free folk lit torches, illuminating a large central chamber. Shadows danced across the walls, revealing winding passages that extended deeper into the earth. Jon exhaled in relief. "It'll do. We can keep a fire here at the entrance, at least to block some of the wind. Set up a camp inside." No one argued. They were all weary, battered from the magical onslaught and the unrelenting cold. Eryx's settled onto his haunches with a long groan, wings folding against his body. The floor of the cave was rough, but at least it offered some dryness compared to the snow outside. Tormund's men spread out, checking the side passages for danger. Hela tended to a small cut on her forehead. Jon collapsed against a rocky ledge, breath coming in short puffs. Yet even in his exhaustion, he felt a sense of accomplishment. They had found the dragon, broken the circle's hold, and survived. Now, the question remained. Could Eryx's heal enough to return to Winterfell? And if he did, what would the North think of Jon Snow leading a dragon back again? This time with an even deeper bond. The possibilities churned in his mind. He glanced at the wounded beast, recalling how, in the Godswood, he'd sworn to ensure that no one ever chained Eryx's again. That vow still held. He would see it through. He caught Tormund's eye, and the wildling shrugged. "You always find the strangest troubles, Snow. Now you have a dragon in a cave. What next?" Jon gave a wry chuckle that lacked true humor. "We rest, we recover. Then we guide him home. Somehow." Tormund grinned. "Home, huh? You really are half a crow and half a dragon, aren't you?" Jon didn't deny it. Instead, he let his head rest against the cave wall, closing his eyes for a moment. In the background, the torchlight flickered, casting shadows of man and dragon alike. The wind howled faintly outside, but the cave was strangely calm. He thought of Winterfell, of the crypts, of the day he first stumbled upon the hidden passage. He thought of Sansa, Bran, Arya, the North. And he thought of Eryx's, a beast of fire bound by ice-cold chains for centuries, now free at last in the harshest land imaginable. Despite all the doubts and the dangers, Jon felt a sense of grim satisfaction. A new chapter had begun, one in which dragon and wolf might carve out a path that defied the old nightmares. And for that single, fleeting moment he allowed himself to hope.